Unfortunately, back in the day, it wasn't quite as simple as, "I'm sorry, it's not you, it's me." Let's travel back in time and look at the medieval way of ending a marriage: divorce by combat. Welcome to Medieval Madness. St. Augustine's ideal of the unbreakable marriage dominated the Middle Ages. By the late medieval period, the marriage vows contained the phrase, "till death do us part," emphasizing the seriousness of the commitment that was being made. In Europe, the church influenced every part of people's lives, and the disapproval of divorce was a Christian invention. Divorce was accepted in ancient Jewish and Roman law, as well as early Germanic law, so it took a while for the medieval church to uphold the idea of marriage as a permanent union. In the early Middle Ages, divorce and remarriage were permitted on several grounds, such as adultery. In fact, divorce by mutual consent was quite common in most of Northern Europe during the 7th and 8th centuries. A man could remarry after 5 years if his wife left him, but only with the bishop's consent. If a woman committed adultery, a man could remarry, but if a husband did the same, then the wife could not. Although a woman was allowed to remarry if her husband had become a slave because of some offence that he had perpetrated, but only if it was her first marriage. Got that? Both men and women whose partner had been taken captive or abducted by an enemy were able to remarry also. In the mid and later period, divorce had two forms: either separation, where a couple could avoid sharing a bed and table, or annulment, based on the grounds that the marriage was never valid to start with. With a separation, the couple remained married and could not remarry until the other spouse died. It was the custom, especially in noble families, for marriages to be arranged. It was usually the men or brothers of a bride that exchanged her for land or wealth. Once an agreement between the two parties was reached at the betrothal stage, the couples were able to actually meet. This was followed by some form of wedding ceremony. The bride was handed over along with her dowry, and a huge banquet would be held. If the families held great status and wealth, the drinking, eating, and celebrating might go on for days. It wasn't until the 12th century that the clergy became involved with either the negotiations or the ceremony itself, unless the marriage was a royal one. Throughout Europe during the early Middle Ages, the new couple were given a gift from the father of the groom known as a mourning gift. This was a contribution towards their finances. Later, it became common for men to arrange matches with girls who would be exchanged for a bride price. Then, the girls would be bought by the groom's family for cash, property, or for something as trivial as a horse, depending upon the family's wealth or lack thereof. By the 11th century, the bride price was replaced with the dowry, where it was the bride's family that now took responsibility for presenting their daughter with a gift on her betrothal. In the Low Countries, England and northern France, this became part of the marriage ceremony and was presented at the door of the church. The poorer the couple were, then the shorter the negotiations took. But once discussions were finished and the betrothal had been announced, the celebrations could take place. On the 6th of January 1114 in Worms, Germany, 12-year-old Empress Matilda of England was married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. Their betrothal had been proclaimed in Utrecht in the Netherlands 4 years earlier. There were too many wedding guests to be counted, but the list included 5 dukes, 30 bishops, and 5 archbishops. Jesters and jongleurs entertained, and there were many gifts presented to the couple. In northern France during the early 12th century, Arnold II of Ardres was married to Gertrude, and their wedding party consisted of 3 days of feasting with food, drink, games, and music. The wedding of Princess Urraca of Leon and Castile to King Garcia Radmir IV of Navarra occurred in the mid-1130s. It was such a lavish affair that the bride had a military escort. The men enjoyed tournament games on horseback, and there were pig and bull fights. The couple received expensive gifts, including many dishes of gold and silver, as well as male and female mules loaded with royal riches. Of course, not everyone was a royal princess. Life for the peasant in medieval Europe was definitely harder than for those of the nobility, but in the world of love and courtship, they were luckier in that they could marry for love, although they did need their lord's permission. Peasant women usually married at a much older age than those that were highborn. They were needed at home from an early age to work for the family and for as long as possible. In England during the early 13th century, a fine known as a merché would need to be paid to the lord of the manor at the marriage of a serf. The French had a similar levy. Many women would pay this themselves rather than relying on funds from their fathers, brothers, or future husbands. It would take a considerable amount of time to save up for such a payment, which also may explain why peasant women married later than noble girls. Couples in the lower classes would probably meet at festivals or markets, or may even know a suitable partner from the same village. If they were caught having sex before marriage, there was a fine known as a legavite, although only the woman was fined and not the man. Despite all of these celebrations of love and romance, things did occasionally turn sour, and sometimes separation and divorce were unavoidable. Married couples were obliged to consent to their partner's sexual demands, regardless as to whether they were in the mood or not. Church law stated that sex within marriage was compulsory. If either partner would not or could not have sex, then the marriage could be deemed illegal. In law, both men and women could accuse their spouse of being impotent in order to dissolve an unconsummated marriage. Usually the woman would declare her wish to be a mother and her husband's inability to fulfill that need. With divorce proving difficult, one way for a woman to end her marriage was by claiming her husband was not fulfilling his duties in the bedroom. But court was mindful of deception and would not just accept a plea of impotence without proof. The only way for a man to prove that he could complete his carnal obligations was to get an erection whilst watched by several legal experts. A physical exam was performed of the man's genitalia by honest women who would check the man's member for its colour, shape, and number. Women didn't escape embarrassment either. They would have to be examined gynecologically to prove that they were still intact and that the marriage had not been consummated. They would be asked to urinate on demand because it was wrongfully thought that women could not perform this bodily function if their hymen was still there. If the man wasn't able to ejaculate or the woman wasn't able to pee when asked to, then they could be freed from their vows. Couples were interrogated about every part of their love life, even their sexual positions. And even if a man admitted that he was impotent, he would have to have this corroborated by witnesses. In Europe, medieval laws were set by the church, and sex for enjoyment was considered to be a sin. Having sex was all about procreation, and excessive sex using improper techniques or positions other than the missionary was seen as immoral. If it could be proved at trial that a man had been forcing his wife into these lustful positions which would not result in pregnancy, then that could also be grounds for divorce. There were times when a judge wanted more evidence and demanded a trial by Congress. That meant that a husband and wife had to attempt to have intercourse in front of several onlookers. And now it's probably a good time to ask you not to kink-shame the peasants of the Middle Ages in the comment section. But do feel free to leave a comment and like this video. 2 trials have been found in the records of the city of York in England, where women endeavoured to end their marriages because of their husband's alleged inability to procreate. In 1368, Nicholas Cantilupe went into hiding after his wife Catherine went to court for an annulment. Obviously, he did not want to be physically examined, as Catherine swore that when Nicholas was asleep in bed, she had tried to feel for his genitals, but had found that area to be, quote, as flat as a man's hand. 2 years later, 3 honest women were asked to examine John Sanderson and found that he was also suffering from some form of deformity of the testicles. Both of these marriages were annulled. Known as the Judgment of God, trial by combat allowed the divine to settle the argument when the ruling classes either could not or would not make a decision. 2 warriors of equal strength and ability fought one another until one of them either yielded or died. The winner was decided by the will of God, so any bid to influence the outcome of the contest, either by using an opponent who was much stronger than the other or by any further means, was supposed to cause godly anger. The hiring of a champion was against the rules, but the practice often took place. In many cases, trial by combat was used as the means of deciding justice. By the late medieval period, there were 2 types of judicial combat: the duel of law, fought by civilians in both civil and criminal cases, and the duel of chivalry. Although the duel of chivalry began during the reign of Edward III, it didn't become popular until the late 14th century, when it was usually fought by nobles for an accusation of treason. In 1306, King Philip VI of France set out his ceremonies for the wager of battle. There he specified 4 terms that needed to be met before a trial by combat could go ahead. 1. The crime must have happened. 2. It must be a capital crime such as murder, rape, or treason. 3. The accused must be sufficiently suspected of the crime. And 4. Every other legal avenue has already been exhausted, and the only method of conviction left was proof by one's body. It was believed in medieval law that the body gave testimony against the accused. That is why using torture was justified. A judicial duel was another way to find out the hidden truth. It was a way to test an oath, as each combatant swore that they were the only one telling the truth. Obviously, one of them was lying, but which one? In the Middle Ages, the duel was a public and conclusive way to answer this question. One very famous trial by combat occurred in 1386 in France during the 100 Years' War. The French knight Jean de Caruges had proven himself a brave warrior in Scotland, although he had lost a considerable amount of money whilst fighting there. In contrast, his one-time friend Jacques Legris, who had not fought in Scotland, had grown richer at home. In the January, Jean set off for Paris to collect his Scottish campaign wages. En route, he met his rival Legris, and angry words were exchanged. Jean's wife, Marguerite, was alone at home with her husband away, and her mother-in-law had gone to Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive on business, taking the servants with her, which meant that it was Marguerite herself who had to answer the door when a visitor called. It was Adam Louvel who spoke about a debt that her husband owed. Suddenly he announced that Jacques Legris was outside and had to speak with her. Marguerite was not comfortable and said it was not convenient, but Louvel insisted that Legris, quote, loves you passionately, he will do anything for you, and he greatly desires to see you. With that, the two men pushed their way inside. After finding that Marguerite was resistant to his advances and to an offer of money, Legris raped her whilst Louvel held her down. Afterwards, Legris threatened death to Marguerite and her family if she told anyone what had happened. On his return, Jean found his wife quiet and withdrawn. She told him about the assault. Enraged, Jean began legal proceedings against Legris, but there were no witnesses. Count Pierre, who also happened to be a patron of Legris, dismissed the case, stating that Marguerite had either imagined or dreamt the attack. So Jean made the brave decision to ask the king for a judicial duel. Jean threw down his gauntlet at the Palais de Justice in Paris, in front of the king, Legris, and a huge crowd of people. But the Court of Justice decided to hear the case as a criminal one. It was all Paris talked about for the whole summer. By this point, Marguerite was clearly pregnant, although there was never any issue about the parentage of the child, because sadly, medieval doctors decreed that it was impossible for a baby to be conceived in rape. Adam Louvel and Marguerite's maid were both questioned and tortured as they were commoners. A claim was made by Legris that Jean had beaten his wife into making a false accusation. Legris said he was 25 miles away with his friend Jean Belletou when the alleged assault happened, but it looked bad for Legris when the man who provided his alibi was also arrested for rape himself later that week in Paris. Unable to reach a decision, Parliament judged that Jacques Legris and Jean de Caruges IV would fight to the death. If Jean died during the duel, his wife Marguerite was to be burnt at the stake for her deceit. After months of preparation, thousands of spectators arrived at the arena of the Abbe Saint-Martin-des-Champs on the 29th of December 1386. At midday, the king arrived and the duel began. Jean and Legris sat on horseback, both wearing plate armour, and the crowd went wild. Each carried a lance, battle axe, longsword, and dagger. The king knighted Legris so that the men were of equal status, and after both men swore an oath to God, the Virgin Mary, and St. George, Jean kissed his wife and promised that he would return. After a clash of lances in which neither of the men were hurt, they dismounted. Jean slipped on the wet ground and Legris stabbed him in the leg, but Jean was able to recover and lunged at Legris, pinning him down. After smashing his faceplate, Jean thrust his dagger into his opponent's neck, killing him. Then he marched over to his wife and embraced her to the sound of the cheering crowds. Jean was awarded with great riches and a place in the royal household, whilst the body of Legris was unceremoniously lugged back to Paris, where it was displayed on the gibbet of Montfaucon. Because there was so much public hype and hysteria over the incident, Parliament deemed that it was to be the last judicial duel permitted by a court in France. During the Middle Ages, if a woman was accused of a crime, she could demand that the verdict was determined independently and use trial by combat. She could elect a champion who was willing to fight in her place. Usually when a woman fought for herself, it was because the opponent was her own husband. Maybe because the person she would customarily choose as her champion was the person she was presently fighting. Marital disputes were commonplace, and European law allowed a woman to take up arms against her spouse if she so wished. In 1467, the German Hans Talhofer wrote a fencing manual. He describes general and advanced techniques for sword fighting using daggers, shields, spears, and other weapons. He gives advice on how to hold a weapon, how to stand, attack, and counterattack. He also devotes a whole chapter to combat between a man and a woman, using detailed drawings with captions to explain the procedure. According to German law, to make it a fair fight, unlike in standard duels, the man was not allowed to choose a weapon. He was put into a 3-foot wide hole up to his waist. He was armed with 3 wooden clubs. The wife, whom it was assumed was not familiar with weapons of war, was provided with 3 stones wrapped in a piece of cloth. Each stone weighed between 1 and 5 pounds. To even things out even further, the husband also had one hand tied behind his back. Although the man could not leave the confines of the pit, the woman was able to run around it freely. If the man touched the edge of the hole with either his hand or arm, then he had to forfeit one of his clubs. After losing them all, he would continue unarmed. If the woman tried to hit him with her sling whilst he was relinquishing a club to the judges, then she would have to forfeit one of her stones. The book shows 2 differing versions of the contest, one where the wife is victorious, showing her holding the man in a headlock, the other shows the man winning by dragging his wife into the hole with him. There are even instructions on the type of clothing to be worn, showing a kind of tight-fitting, hooded bodysuit with stirrup legs. As well as this, the book includes tips on the common mistakes to avoid and techniques for getting out of a hold. Although the duel was hardly ever a fight to the death, sadly defeat for either of the parties always resulted in the loss of a life anyway. The man would be executed with honour in the town square, and the woman would be buried alive. Truly medieval. It seems that students of the modern world and their reputation for drunken debauchery aren't too dissimilar to students of the medieval world. Let's travel back in time and learn about learning in the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. During the Middle Ages, most rulers increased their power through either birthright or war. Education played very little, if any, part in their success, and fighting skills were much more important. And although the influence of both Roman and Germanic cultures could be seen all over Europe, in the justice system and society as a whole, it was the church that became the guiding force when developing a medieval educational system. This religious influence meant that bishops, monks, and priests became responsible for teaching and for the organization of education as a whole. By 1330, just 5% of the European population were given any sort of formal education, because for most people it was not considered necessary. Only as kingdoms became larger and more complex was the need for administrational skills such as writing and arithmetic thought crucial. And even then, instruction was usually only available to the nobility if they desired it. Meanwhile, those of the lower classes could not afford the educational fees required to attend monasteries and cathedral schools, and were usually put to work in childhood. By the time they had reached the age of about 12, they were already considered an adult. The system was deliberately designed to keep the serfs uneducated. In addition, and in order to keep the workers in their place, the lord of the manor had to keep his permission for any peasant child to be taught. Anyone caught being schooled without permission would be fined. Of course, the children of peasants would be taught the skills that they needed to survive through work from their own parents. Boys would be taken into the fields by their fathers to learn farming, and girls would help to cook, tend to the animals, cultivate the vegetable patch, or perhaps watch their mother spinning or weaving. Boys. Books were a rare commodity, and being highly expensive, the only way to become educated was through the passing on of knowledge from a teacher. Highly influenced by the church, the boys were taught to read and write in Latin. The ancient texts of Greece and Rome were followed to teach logic, rhetoric, and grammar, known as the trivium, which are the 3 fundamental liberal arts, as well as the 4 other more complicated liberal arts of astrology, music, arithmetic, and geometry, although many of the courses were based on theory and superstition. The boys sat together on the floor during lessons, which began early in the morning and ended at sunset. This meant that classes lasted for much longer during the summer months. As vellum was made from animal skin and expensive, and the use of paper and ink could only be afforded by the highest ranking nobles and monasteries, note-taking was done on wooden tablets filled with either black or green wax. A stylus made from ivory or bone was used to scratch words into the surface. Paper would only be given to those students who had perfected their writing skills, and only then if they had the funds to pay for it. This resulted in huge quantities of information having to be memorized by heart. Corporal punishment was used not just for bad behaviour, but also for mistakes. This was usually in the form of birching, where a birch rod would be used to hit the bare buttocks of a child. It was thought that the mistake would never be made again, for fear of the punishment. Boys who were intended to become knights were fostered into another knight's home to learn their skills. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the code of chivalry was proposed by the church and was expected to be followed, so it was important that knights could read and write in order to understand and follow the rules, which included fearing God and the church, serving the liege lord, protecting the weak, showing no mercy to the infidel, and respecting the honour of women. Any knight who could not read or write was looked down upon. Girls. Only a small section of the female population would receive any formal education. In Europe, this generally took place in a nunnery. After basic instruction, many girls would decide to take vows themselves, join the religious order, and leave out a cloistered life. Others began their convent education around the age of 7 and were educated until they were ready for marriage, usually around the age of 14. A convent curriculum consisted of reading and writing, music, manners, and ethics, as well as practical skills such as spinning, weaving, and embroidery. In fact, it was embroidery that nuns spent most of their time doing. Sewing pictures of Bible stories and tales from Greek mythology meant that a good knowledge of literature and history was needed. Music was also important because the chants were sung for the glory of God. Because of the regularity of invasion and war during the period, many nuns taught surgery and medicine to other women. Some nunneries would teach the classical writings and the liberal arts like those taught to boys. Many well-educated nuns became abbesses and were treated on an equal footing to their male counterparts. Sometimes when they were just into their early teens, they would have control over large properties and write treatises on rhetoric and logic, and were generally quite powerful. Those girls lucky enough to be born into noble households usually had a personal nurse until the age of about 7, and were then taught academic work by chaplains. As men were often away fighting, girls were taught about household management and medicine in case the men returned ill or wounded. Girls also learned the social graces like singing, dancing, deportment, and the art of conversation. Equestrian skills and an understanding of chess, dice games, and falconry were prized, and young ladies were taught hospitality, etiquette, and to moderate their voices at all times. Even for the peasant classes, it was mostly in the home where the skills and information that girls needed was transmitted. Mothers and fathers were responsible for teaching religion and passing on any basic reading and writing skills that they had. Mothers also taught their daughters household skills and whatever medical knowledge they had acquired. Generally, married life and the raising of children were the main goals for a medieval girl. Women were under the protection of men, and whatever education they could complete was intended to help them become a better wife and mother. Monastic schools. Headed by the Vatican, monastic schools were part of a monastery and run by an order such as the Benedictine or the Franciscan monks. Education was nearly always meant to lead to a life of working in the religious community. Focus was given to studying and copying the works of Greek and Roman philosophers, polymaths, and physicians. Certain monastic schools even studied more contentious topics like botany and physics. Some of these schools would allow the teaching of boys from poor families, but they would have to serve in the cathedral in order to be considered for the opportunity. Grammar schools. By the 11th century, the merchants began to emerge as the new middle class, and some of these successful merchants came from the lower classes. As new towns sprang up, they attracted more specialist traders such as apothecaries, grocers, and cobblers. Guilds were set up, and wealthy merchants began to establish and fund local schools for the education of their own children. These schools became known as grammar schools. The teaching of Latin grammar was essential as it was the language used by many of the European merchants. Latin was a universal language across the continent, and anyone wanting to trade successfully in Europe needed to have a working knowledge of the language. The education of a merchant's son would ensure that his business could continue. During the late medieval period, subjects were expanded to include the teaching of English, as well as other European languages, geography, and the natural sciences. Most schools were small, with just one room. A single tutor would teach the older boys, who were then expected to teach the younger ones. At the age of 14 or 15, some students would go on to continue their education at university. Universities. By the end of the 11th century, universities had begun to appear. At first, they were just groups of ecclesiastical tutors who would meet with students in houses or churches and even in public parks with the purpose of learning. Later, buildings were rented and then built specifically for their needs. In the beginning, university students studied divinity, as they were intended to later work in some capacity within the church. However, during the later Middle Ages, many wealthy merchants and nobles wished for their sons to study law or medicine. The first university was founded in 1088 in Bologna, northern Italy, but this was closely followed by Oxford in England, which was expanded after King Henry II banned English students from attending the University of Paris in 1167. There was hostility between the students and townsfolk from the beginning, which resulted in the outbreaks of violence and rioting. In 1354, a riot broke out when two Oxford scholars complained about the standard of wine in a tavern. The unrest lasted for 3 days. Several towns buildings and colleges were ransacked, and many townspeople and students were killed. A few universities in Europe specialized in specific subjects. One would best study medicine at Salerno in southern Italy, theology in Paris, or attend Bologna for law. By the 1500s, many of these universities had gained such an excellent reputation that both tutors and scholars were traveling from all over Europe to teach and study in them. Many of these medieval universities are still great centers of learning today. Because young men found themselves far away from home and unsupervised during their studies, they developed a reputation for drunkenness and shameless behavior. They were often condemned for their use of prostitutes and for drinking and gambling. This is interesting when one considers that during the 1400s, 1/3 of men who were later given a high position in the clergy, such as bishops, archbishops, and cardinals, attended university. A typical day started with study between 5 and 6 am, and students were expected to be fluent in Latin by this point so that they could speak and deliberate logically in the language. A Bachelor of Arts degree was awarded after 3 or 4 years of studying the liberal arts, and a Master's after a further 3 years. Then the student could go on to the higher fields of law, medicine, or theology, which was considered the most prestigious degree during the Middle Ages. This could take up to an additional 6 to 12 years for a Master's or doctorate. As Europe emerged from the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, it had reached high levels of attainment in its universities and great developments in art, literature, and science. And it seemed that the medieval period created the basis for the educational system that we still use today. The attitude towards love, sex, and marriage went through some interesting changes during the medieval period. Probably due to the prevalence of religion, especially Christianity, becoming such an important part of life. One impression that we often associate with medieval sexuality is that of complete repression. A world where a group of people, namely priests and other clerics who don't have sex, tell the people who are having sex how they should and shouldn't be having it, and even what their thoughts regarding sex should be. Now, as far as the church is concerned, all sexual thoughts and behaviour are sinful. Even those who are married are told that to enjoy the experience of sex is morally reprehensible, and the devil is always waiting to use sexual temptation to drag humanity down into a pit of damnation. Trapped by an overwhelming fear of committing sin, and with a total lack of understanding of one's own body, the poor medievals were punished by the church and shunned by society. The slightest slip in the expected moral standards may have made sex an abnormal part of medieval life. On the other hand, in opposition to this church-controlled, stricter moral code, there is a much bawdier image of life in the Middle Ages. One of noble lords keeping mistresses, monks and nuns engaging in clandestine liaisons, priests seducing their penitent parishioners, and peasants copulating behind the haystacks. A view that shows the medievals completely ignoring the church and its teachings, and dismissing them as hypocritical. Can you blame them? Let's travel back in time and get it on as we talk about sex during the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Abstinence. It must have been quite confusing in the Middle Ages. Too much sex could be lethal, but no sex at all could be fatal. The medical faculties believed that long-term celibacy presented a problem and was harmful to health, especially for young men. It was thought to affect the heart and damage it, thereby harming other parts of the body. Sexual abstinence could cause headaches, weight loss, anxiety, and even death. So, although as a spiritual quality, celibacy was valued highly by the medievals, medically a celibate was as much at risk as a philanderer, as sex was thought to be necessary for a healthy life. Whilst away fighting on the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century, King Louis VIII of France insisted on remaining faithful to his wife, Blanche. On his return to Paris, Louis became ill and died quite quickly. The belief was that he had died because of his celibacy. The 12th century Norman poet Ambroise wrote that at the Siege of Acre, more than 3,000 men were killed, but 100,000 men died, quote, "because from women they abstained. 'Twas for God's love that they restrained themselves. They had not perished, thus had they not been abstemious." A group of 11th century noblewomen wanted sex so badly that they petitioned the Duke of Normandy to prematurely end the ongoing military campaign so that they could get their husbands back early, just for that very reason. For most crusaders, celibacy was a temporary annoyance which would be ended as soon as they returned to their wives. But for the medieval clergy, sexual abstinence was a permanent state, leaving them with a difficult decision. Thomas Becket, who was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1162 until his murder in 1170, was advised by his doctor to give up celibacy, being told that it was bad for his health and not appropriate for his age or complexion. Becket ignored the advice and didn't die until many years later, even then by an assassin's blade. However, an unnamed bishop from Louvain, Belgium, wasn't as fortunate. He struggled to remain celibate for a long time. On his promotion to bishop, he abstained for a whole month, but his genitals grew so enlarged that he became very ill. His friends and family begged him to, quote, "take a woman to himself." But he battled with the temptation. Unfortunately, he died within a few days. Humor-based medical theory prescribed that regular bleeding was necessary for those who practiced sexual abstinence as a way to balance the humors. Crying and sweating were also offered as alternatives to intercourse, so not much has changed. Medieval women were not invulnerable to illness because of celibacy either. The female seed that needed to be released during sex would build up within her body and cause the womb to suffocate. This produced a shortness of breath, fainting, and even death in serious cases. Of course, the best way to avoid this was to marry and have regular, church-endorsed, missionary-position intercourse. Other remedies included a strict diet and vinegar suppositories. Shockingly, and in complete opposition to the church, some physicians did recommend the option of masturbation. Medieval penitentials, which were basically handbooks on how to best confess your sins, recognized masturbation as a great big fat sin. Penances were quite heavy, anywhere between 30 days and 2 years of fasting were a typical punishment. And there were degrees of sexual sin, such as masturbation, masturbation with a friend, with someone of the same sex, sex in the wrong position, sex with a horse, and sodomy, which was the worst sin of all. And who you were mattered as well. If you were unmarried and had sex with a goat, then that's not as bad as a sin as if you were married and had sex with a goat. Your age was significant too. Being young gave you a license to get away with a lot, as the church and its confessors recognized that an unmarried youth lacked another opening for their desires, so to speak. So, as I'm sure you're pleased to hear, dear viewer, in the hierarchy of sexual sins, masturbation came quite low down. In fact, medical opinion regarded masturbation as a kind of protective treatment for both sexes. But a word of warning, a lack of moderation is always evidence of a bad habit. Albertus Magnus, a 13th century Dominican cleric who was a prolific writer, related a tale of a very horny monk who suffered an unhappy fate. He desired a beautiful lady 70 times, or for lack of a better term, spanked the monkey before morning prayers, and sadly died. During the autopsy, his eyes were found to have been obliterated, and his brain had shriveled to the size of a pomegranate. In medieval life, his death reflected just how dangerous the sin of masturbation could be. Magnus also stated that regarding the desires of women, masturbating by using, quote, their fingers or other instruments, and by the heat of friction, the humour comes out, thus reducing a woman's craving for sex, thereby keeping her chaste. And later medieval texts suggested that stimulation could be done by either the patient herself or by a physician or midwife, if she wasn't married and her life was in danger, an excuse I'm sure they used a lot. This treatment could be performed without sin, although John of Gaddesden, a 14th century doctor, believed the best cure for a libidinous woman was foreign travel, medication, and plenty of exercise. And women could get into trouble just for causing the arousal of a man, even within the bounds of marriage. The 11th century Burchard, Bishop of Worms in what is now Germany, wrote 20 books on canon law. In one, he states that women were not allowed to have bread dough kneaded into their nude buttocks. Apparently, then baking the bread and feeding it to their husbands caused the men to, quote, burn with love for them. Punishment for this strange sex act, which we can assume actually happened, was quite harsh, with penance lasting for 2 years. A knight in shining armour. The prevalence of knights and their chivalric behaviour caused the notion of love to also take on a new form in the Middle Ages. Only those who were completely submissive to their partner were able to experience this sort of perfect and completely unattainable love. This gallant champion idea gained popularity during the Middle Ages and produced a change in how medieval marriage was seen. The idea of courtly love began in the French courts of Provence, Aquitaine, and Burgundy in the late 11th century. But it was the major poets and authors of the time, such as Chaucer, Marie de France, and de Troyes, that popularized the idea that a true knight should be willing to do anything for the love and honor of his lady. These stories soon had the people believing that courtly love was the only path to true fulfillment. This kind of love didn't need to be based around marriage either, because it was more about love than sex. Because it was a time of devoutness towards the Christian Church, it was no surprise when some decided that they wanted to live a chaste life. One woman who chose to take this path was Marguerite Kemp, who it is believed wrote the first autobiography in the English language. Marjorie was born in East Anglia, England, in the 14th century, and married her husband John when she was about 20. Known as a mystic, the extremely pious woman experienced multiple religious visions throughout her life. After giving birth to at least 14 children, Marjorie wished to take a vow of chastity, and can you blame her? In the summer of 1413, she discussed this with her husband as they were walking to the market one day. Without permission from her spouse, a life of celibacy was impossible. John asked Marjorie which she would prefer, that someone kill him with a sword, or that she have sex with him again. Marjorie chose the former, and so the negotiations began. John finally agreed to Marjorie's demand as long as Marjorie paid off his debts and agreed to eat dinner with him every Friday. It seems that Marjorie fasted on Fridays and John, for unknown reasons, wished this to stop. The obligation of sexual consent only went one way in medieval Jewish society though. Then it was the right of a woman to demand that her husband have intercourse with her. This was one of 3 things a Jewish woman could demand in her marriage, the other 2 being food and clothing. This probably had more to do with a woman's right to have children, rather than from a pleasure aspect. It could also be connected to the much earlier practice of polygamy, when the rights of one wife should not take precedence over the rights of another. Virginity. For the medievals, the idea of being a virgin was not just a physical state, but also a mental one as well. Even thinking unclean thoughts was enough for the church to render you no longer pure, and this was true for both men and women. Masturbation and being penetrated by a demon were equally unfavourable when trying to safeguard one's honour. But it was believed that a loss of virginity could be won back. And no, not just by playing Magic the Gathering. In one of her visions, Marjorie Kemp was told by Jesus that she would be a virgin once again in heaven, because she was so pure of heart and mind, despite the fact that she had given birth to over a dozen children. Unfortunately though, there were tales of people throwing themselves into nettles or immersing themselves into icy water, and of priests castrating themselves, for this unattainable ideal of purity. The things we do for love. Medieval ideas about contraception could be quite strange too. The withdrawal method was popular, as was jumping up and down immediately after the sex act, and also having the woman sneeze. But there are accounts of using mint around the genital area, and hanging a weasel's testicles around one's neck in the hope of avoiding a pregnancy. These attempts at contraception mean it is wrong to think that in the Middle Ages, every couple was happy to go about producing dozens of offspring. For many, attempts of contraception were put to use. Penis enlargement was also a thing, and solutions for this ranged from washing the member with warm sheep's milk to rubbing it with a mixture of chopped earthworms and jojoba oil. And if all else failed, there was always the option of beating your penis with a stick. Apparently they all achieved the same result, whatever that might have been. People of the Middle Ages didn't tend to have quite as high a life expectancy as we do nowadays, and we're about to look into one of the many reasons why. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at weird medieval drugs and remedies. Welcome to Medieval Madness. In the Middle Ages, most people never saw a doctor. Peasants would normally visit a cunning woman or a monk who would provide them with some sort of herbal remedy, as well as prayer. The few physicians that were available would only treat the rich. Disease was thought to be caused by the imbalance of the four humours: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. The prevention of illness and the preservation of one's health also required the regulation of one's emotions, food and drink, exercise, and rest. This balance could be maintained with a healthy lifestyle and the use of what were mainly botanical drugs. The opium poppy is the source of opiates such as morphine and heroin. It has been cultivated for centuries. The farming of opium poppies is known to have taken place in Mesopotamia 3400 BC. The Sumerians referred to it as the joy plant. It was grown in ancient China, Persia, Egypt, and Greece. Known for its effective properties of pain relief, it was used to help people with insomnia and even to calm crying children. In 1095, Pope Urban sent out a call across Western Europe to retake Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Hundreds of thousands of men joined the cause of this religious war, and in the summer of 1099 reclaimed the Holy City as their own. For the next 200 years, more crusades were fought in the Holy Land, with crusaders bringing home all sorts of exotic items such as silk, spices, and exotic fruits. Incredible stories of Eastern potions also began to spread, potions that were said to induce undreamed of delights and superhuman bravery. So although opium was already known to medieval Europeans, it was the returning crusaders who really made the drug popular. Magic mushrooms. This superhuman strength was also noted in the mention of the Scandinavian berserkers, who are thought to have consumed hallucinogenic mushrooms before going into battle. They were an elite brand of warriors who lived during the Viking Age between the 8th and 11th centuries. They often wore wolf or bearskins so that their allies would know who they were in the battlefield and would stay out of their way. Berserkers were unable to tell friend from foe when they were under the influence, and an unimaginable fury came over them. The rage began with shivering and teeth chattering, then their face would swell up and change colour. A tremendous frenzy would come upon them and they would howl like wild animals. They would bite the edge of their own shields in anger. Then they would kill any man that they saw until the fighting was over. Afterwards, the berserker would feel lethargic and become weak in the mind for several days. There are no records that can tell us specifically what drug was used, if any, but a type of mushroom called Amanita muscaria was common in Scandinavia at that time. These mushrooms are known to have a hallucinogenic effect when eaten. In theriac, Denmark, the grave of a high-ranking woman was found which contained seeds from the henbane plant. Although poisonous in large doses, henbane is also a hallucinogen when taken in smaller quantities. It should also be noted that drinking alcohol was a fundamental part of Viking culture. Even their gods drank heavily. They mostly drank ale, but mead was especially prized. Attempts to recreate Viking alcohol have produced a brew that was sweet and malty. It was also particularly strong with a volume of 9%. It's not difficult to see how this drink could easily become addictive. The theriac. The Black Death of the 14th century was shocking in terms of deaths. Coming out of Central Asia and sweeping along the Silk Roads, it is estimated to have killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people by the 1350s. The ravages of the disease affected all parts of the late medieval world. But the aftermath of the Black Death brought with it some surprising changes in the social order of medieval Europe. The sheer volume of deaths raised wages for the survivors, meaning that the standard of living also rose. Many migrated from the countryside to the towns and cities. Merchants were becoming more rich and more powerful in the Italian city-states and in the northern Low Countries. Even London, which was once a minor player for European trade, was now a busy port. It was also a turning point in Europe for the advancement of medicine, and an opium-based mixture, known as a theriac or treacle, became one of the main treatments used by the plague doctors as a prevention against the plague and other diseases. A theriac was a compound medicine, a blend of many different ingredients, some contained up to 80. Several of the ingredients had medicinal properties, whilst others were there to balance the humours, and it contained large quantities of opium. The theories of the ancient Greek physician Galen were highly regarded during this time, as he had formulated a theriac which helped victims of the Antonine Plague, which began during the 2nd century CE. The most famous theriac invented in antiquity was probably that of Andromachus, the personal physician to the Emperor Nero. It contained herbals, minerals, poisons, the blood and flesh of animals, all mixed together with honey to form a jam-like substance. It was said to cure various illnesses, such as migraines, hearing loss, sight loss, and even rabies, because it cured, quote, the bite of serpents, mad dogs, and wild beasts, as well as headaches, coughing, and diarrhea. One of the main symptoms of the plague included the swelling of the lymph nodes into large, extremely painful lumps known as buboes. This pain was greatly alleviated by the use of the theriac, but would not have had any influence over whether a patient lived or died. The concoctions were very complex and took days to prepare, and their exotic constituents were too expensive to be brought by common men. One recipe of the time lists ground coral, viper's flesh, cinnamon, and myrrh among its ingredients. The Black Death created an obsession with health, and apothecary shops began to pop up all over Europe. But theriac was highly habit-forming, and during the 14th century, the selling of opiates and laxatives became regulated in France, because they were so addictive and dangerous to take. Physicians and surgeons were sent around to inspect the quality of the theriac made by the apothecaries at their shops. During the 12th century, theriac was being made in Venice and widely exported to the rest of Europe. In England, it was known as Venetian treacle. Theriac was so effective that it was thought to have magical qualities, which would also echo the stories that came back with the Crusaders from the Middle East. Many medieval manuscripts refer to an opium-based drink, called a dwale, which was said to leave a person unconscious. It was usually consistent in the type of ingredients that were used, as well as alcohol. Benign herbals such as bryony root, boar bile, lettuce, and vinegar were mixed with the more dangerous opium poppy sap and the highly poisonous hemlock juice, mandrake root, and henbane. A few spoonfuls of the herb would be boiled in water with small amounts of the other more dangerous ingredients before being added to wine. This powerful mix was given to a patient who was told to drink the concoction until he fell asleep. Hopefully the doctor would be able to operate before the unconscious patient woke up. That's if the drugged wine didn't kill him in the first place. Strange treatments. The use of dead bodies in medicine dates back as far as ancient Egypt, where powdered mummies were used in remedies. The Romans would eat the organs of dead gladiators and drink their blood, as it was thought that the soul of the deceased would be imparted into the patient. In medieval times, human fat was boiled down and rendered before being made into an ointment for arthritis or gout. Apothecaries used ingredients such as powdered skulls to treat a headache, epilepsy, and even strokes. A type of moss called usnea, which grows in graveyards, was also added to some medicines and is now known to boost the immune system. Another strange item used in medicines is animal feces. Greek white, which is the white coating on dried dog muck, was used for sore throats, tonsillitis, and diseases of the lungs. When applied externally, it was thought to dissolve growths and swellings. The dung from other animals also had its uses. Mice droppings were used to treat intestinal worms. In the 1300s, sheep manure was used to treat jaundice, and oxen dung was thought to cure a fever. The more exotic excrement of a crocodile or elephant was sometimes called in for the making of an expensive theriac, but the most common faecial ingredients to be found on an apothecary's shelf were those of the cow, horse, or dog. Urine is another nasty ingredient that has been used to make medicine in the Middle Ages. Soldiers have gladly urinated on one another's wounds to clean them up on the battlefield for centuries. Apothecaries sold distilled urine at their stores. By drawing on the ideas of Pliny the Elder, fresh urine was recommended by medieval physicians for the treatment of sores, burns, and affections of the anus. Following the teaching of the four humours, as well as examining blood and feces, urine was especially useful in diagnosing medieval illness. Physicians used uroscopy as a diagnostic tool. They would have a urine wheel, which was basically a chart divided into several different parts, each one showing the urine in a different colour. But the physician would also go further and not only smell, but taste the patient's urine as well, as each colour combined with a certain odour and flavour meant a distinct diagnosis. European physicians used the urine wheel and uroscopy into the 19th century, and chemical analysis of urine is still used today as a diagnostic tool, although tasting is no longer allowed. If you see a doctor doing this, please do tell someone. Remedies for sore throats were equally as unpleasant. Snail syrup was a traditional treatment in the Middle Ages. The recipe stated that a pound of garden snails had to be collected early in the morning whilst the dew was still on the grass. The shells could be removed and the snails must be cut open and placed in a bag with half a pound of sugar. The bag should then be hung over a bowl to collect the mucus as the snails dissolved. The mixture could also be used for internal ulcers and coughs, as well as externally for burns and wounds. A company based in Chile still sells cough syrup containing the glutinous essence of snails. A more serious throat infection called quinsy was a complication of tonsillitis and was more common in the Middle Ages because of the lack of antibiotics. One pretty weird and disgusting remedy to cure it was to, quote, "Take a fat cat and flay it well, clean and draw out the guts. Take the grease of a hedgehog and the fat of a bear, and resins of fenugreek, and sage and gum of honeysuckle and virgin wax. Crumble all of this up, and stuff the cat with it, as you would a goose. Roast it all and gather the grease, and rub it onto the patient." There were many other strange and wonderful drugs and treatments available at this time. From using what we now regard as Class A drugs to cure the plague, to wearing donkey skins to alleviate rheumatism. Swallowing young frogs was thought to cure asthma, and consuming 9 lice mixed with ale would cure jaundice. It's no wonder that during the Middle Ages, most people were lucky to live past their 40th birthday. Thank you once again for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do join me and all of our feline friends in thanking modern medicine, especially in the current state of the world. They were considered to be dishonourable among men, and in most countries they were reviled and made to live on the fringes of society, well away from the main citizens. It's no surprise that the vocation of medieval executioners is up there as one of the most undesirable jobs in the Middle Ages, along with leech collector and gong farmer. Lawlessness and crime were widespread across the world. Rape, murder, theft, heresy, every type of sin and debauchery ran unchecked throughout medieval society. Most countries were trying to move away from the idea of criminal prosecutions being a private matter. The authorities developed new legal procedures whereby they could arrest suspects without waiting for an accusation from the victim. This meant that they could investigate, question, and secure a confession from the accused, and once found guilty, for most people justice was swift, brutal, and without mercy. With most criminals evading arrest, an example had to be made of those who were caught, and what better deterrent than a public execution? One of the earliest recorded positions of official executioner dates from the beginning of the 13th century. Nicknamed La Justice, Nicholas Johann was appointed in Normandy, northern France. The idea of having just one person responsible for any state-sanctioned killing quickly spread throughout the rest of Europe, as capital punishment became more and more popular in a bid to rid the towns of lawlessness. But just what was it like to be a medieval executioner? Well, let's travel back in time and have a look at the life of a medieval executioner. Welcome to Medieval Madness. It's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it. It was William the Conqueror who reintroduced beheading to Britain as an official form of execution. Convicted of treason for his part in the Revolt of the Earls, Waleth, Earl of Northumbria, was beheaded with a sword in May of 1076 on St Giles Hill near Winchester. But the majority of beheadings took place in the capital at the Tower of London and at Tower Hill just outside the walls, because it was the main prison for high-born traitors. In fact, a permanent scaffold stood on Tower Hill from 1485 for those who might not necessarily have betrayed their country, but had just really annoyed the reigning monarch in some way. For commoners found guilty of high treason, the punishment was far less dignified and much more brutal. Low-born men were hanged, drawn and quartered, and low-born women were burnt at the stake. Simply put, there were two types of beheadings, by axe or by sword. Either way, the prisoner would be blindfolded so that they did not see the weapon bearing down on them and at the crucial moment flinch or move. Execution by axe meant that a wooden block, often shaped to accept the neck, would be used. The prisoner would kneel and lean forward so that their neck rested on the block, with the head being in a downward position. With the neck prominent, there was a better angle for the stroke of the axe. In Britain, the traditional woodsman's axe was used, usually with a blade about 20 inches long, 10 inches wide, and with a 5-foot long handle. By sword, the person was made to kneel down, or if they were particularly short, it could be done whilst they were standing up. Most European swords were over 3 feet long and weighed over 4 pounds. Both the axe and the sword had handles long enough for the executioner to use both hands, giving him the greatest control. The desired outcome was that the head was severed with a single blow, and if carried out correctly, it was a humane method of capital punishment. Unfortunately, this was not always the case, because the vertebra and muscles in the neck are strong, and it might take several blows to completely separate the head from the body. Mary, Queen of Scots, who was executed for treason during the reign of Elizabeth I, found herself on the other end of a botched beheading in 1587. The first strike missed and hit her on the back of the head. The second severed her neck, but it took a third blow to completely decapitate her. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was executed under the orders of Henry VIII in 1541 for plotting against the king and supporting Catholicism. She had to be dragged to the block and have her neck held there by force. The more experienced executioner had been sent to the north to deal with rebels, and poor Margaret was left to the mercy of an inexperienced boy to carry out the sentence. Probably felt similar to when they give you an apprentice hairdresser. The French ambassador who witnessed the spectacle reported that the youth, quote, hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. Apparently, it took 11 strikes before she was pronounced dead. In any event, a beheading is always a gruesome affair, as there are both the carotid and jugular veins in the neck that spurt blood when severed and cause massive hemorrhaging. There have also been descriptions of the eyes and mouths of severed heads moving after a beheading, because the brain still has about 7 seconds of stored oxygen after it has been amputated. Living on the edge. The black-robed, hooded image that we often have of the medieval axe-wielding executioner is a common stereotype. But an executioner rarely wore a black robe. Those participating in a beheading would often be stripped to the waist, as the blood splatter could be washed off easier that way. And wearing a hood to preserve anonymity was pointless. Everyone in the area knew who the executioner was. It was a job that no one wanted. When all was said and done, whether it was by beheading, hanging, or burning, the executioner was believed to be a disturbed individual, ready and willing to take a life on command, a sinner with no chance of salvation. Many found the position thrust upon them, passed on from father to son, because the whole family was reviled, and any children of an executioner were unable to get honest work as the guilds refused them entry. Others were convicted criminals themselves who were willing to take on the job of killing others to have their own capital sentence overturned. In almost every culture, the medieval executioner was ostracized and detested by society. In most countries, they had to live with their families away from everyone else. In France, they had to wear a red or yellow coat that singled them out as dishonorable. They were given their own table at inns and public houses where no one else sat, and had their own tankard, as no one wanted to be polluted by anything that they had touched. In Germany, they were particularly hated, and in Strasbourg they were denied Holy Communion and made to stand at the back of the church during services. Even their graves were separated from the rest of the citizens. In England, you could actually be awarded compensation if you were mistaken for an executioner, and in Spain, his house was painted red, and his fee was thrown at him rather than handed to him. Everyone feared contamination from direct physical contact with such a dishonorable man. For Spaniards, the garrote was the chosen method of execution. It involved the prisoner being restrained in a high-backed chair, a metal band placed around the neck. The executioner would stand behind and tighten the band with a crank until asphyxiation occurred. He was always arrested for murder after he had carried out the killing, but he was also always tried and then acquitted because he had, quote, committed murder by virtue of his office. Most of the work was infrequent, and executioners travelled around a region from town to town to carry out their duties, so their wages were rarely enough to live on. Therefore, it was necessary for them to make money in other ways, such as tax collecting from prostitutes and lepers, cleaning latrines, or working as knackers, which involved removing the carcasses of dead or dying animals from public roads. In Dijon, France, they were tasked with killing any pigs that were found within the town limits, as this was illegal. In fact, they were given any other jobs that might be essential, but were also denigrated within society because they were filthy or seen as degrading. There were some perks though. In Paris, the executioner was allowed to take a portion of every load of grain that came into the marketplace, but he had to use some form of utensil to scoop the grain and wasn't allowed to touch it with his bare hands for fear that he would contaminate it. They were also entitled to all of the property left by the condemned person. A headsman was expected to carry out their job in a professional manner for fear of being accused as cruel or incompetent. Failure to achieve a successful beheading, such as taking more than 3 swings of an axe or sword, could have dire consequences. Unsatisfied spectators have been known to attack an inefficient executioner. If he survived the assault, he would be financially punished by the loss of his fee, and might even face imprisonment or be removed from his position. Hanging. For violent crimes that were committed openly, such as murder, the typical punishment was beheading, but for crimes that were deemed more treacherous, sneaky and cunning, such as theft and treason, punishment would often be hanging. The authorities could then decide what form of hanging was the best for the committed crime. Should a rope be used, or a chain? Should the prisoner be hanged, drawn and quartered? How long should the body be exposed on the gallows and left to rot as an example for all to see? Almost every medieval town or village had a permanent gibbet where public executions could be carried out, usually on higher ground whereby everybody could get a good view. It was rare to find a gibbet that did not have a skeleton or corpse dangling from it, left to decompose as a warning for others. The executioner would climb up a ladder and tie the rope to the crossbeam. The noose would be placed around the prisoner's neck, and he or she would be suspended and strangled to death. The prisoner or their family might actually be expected to pay for the rope themselves, or the executioner might even buy it so that he could sell it later as a souvenir, or display it in the local pub for a small fee. It wasn't until the 19th century that the long drop method was used at hangings. This was a more humane technique, as it instantly broke the neck, making death instantaneous rather than the slow process of strangulation. In some cases, the judge would order that the condemned should be disciplined by experiencing the horrific sensation of hanging only. So the prisoner would have rope tied beneath the armpits instead of the neck before they were suspended. This also had its dangers though, as the weight of the body might tighten the ropes around the chest and cause asphyxiation anyway. Many were found to be dead when they were cut down after this form of punishment. a dirty business. In order to protect himself from being accused of murder, the executioner would always present his warrant, a license that permitted him to execute the sentence of death. Today, we can find it undesirable that the occupation of an executioner was so despised. Taking another life, no matter how vile or sinful that person may be, will always seem abhorrent. Being an outcast from society pushed him into earning money from all the degrading jobs that no one else was willing to do. The job of medieval executioner was a solitary and gruesome life, but it was better than being on the other side of the axe. When we think of crime and punishment in the medieval period, we often think of a chaotic system of judgment and brutal punishments that seem out of proportion with the seriousness of the crime. In medieval Europe, law and order was harsh. It was assumed that people would only behave well if they feared the penalty of breaking the law. There was a gibbet on the outskirts of most towns in England. There, criminals would be hanged, their bodies left to rot for many weeks, as a stark warning as to the reality of breaking the law. However, this obviously wasn't the great deterrent that the establishment hoped it would be. In just 1 year, the northern city of Lincoln had 114 murders, 89 robberies with violence, and 65 woundings. Considering Lincoln had a population of just 7,000 people in 1202, those numbers seem quite high. And when you also consider that only 2 people were executed for these crimes, it would seem that a lot of medievals were getting away with their offences. Let's travel back in time and have a look at the life of a criminal in the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Blasphemy. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was a dominant force, and many countries maintained order by imposing religious or canon laws on the people, as well as those decided by the monarch. Refusing to acknowledge God or offering up any ideas not sanctioned by the Church was considered to be blasphemous. The Dominican friar and philosopher Thomas Aquinas amazingly considered blasphemy, quote, a sin more grave than murder, because it was directed against God rather than against one's neighbour. This view was also considered true by the medieval leaders of Islam too. In Kuwait, punishment was as brutal as it could get, with stoning, burning at the stake, or having an elephant crush your head being the standard penalty. Across medieval Europe, there were many terrible punishments for the offence, including garroting in Spain, mutilation in Germany, and flogging or branding in England. Unfortunately, it was very easy to commit the sin of blasphemy. Just a tiny slip in the company of the wrong person could result in someone suddenly becoming an unwitting criminal. Murder. Why the Middle Ages in Europe was so violent has often been debated. Historians have argued that almost everyone had witnessed a murder or knew someone who had been killed. It's claimed that in the Oxford or London of the medievals, you were more likely to be murdered than die by accident. Getting away from the scene of the crime after a murder was quite easy. There were large areas of woodland and countryside between urban settlements in medieval Europe, giving the perpetrator the perfect opportunity to flee the scene, and the chances of getting caught were small. Law enforcement was practically non-existent, although some Italian city-states were lucky enough to have salaried police officers. Theft. The medievals stole for many reasons, just as people do so today. Theft was probably one of the most common crimes committed during the Middle Ages. Just like murderers, the medieval thief could easily slip away unnoticed. How crimes were perceived and the severity of the punishment given seemed to depend on where the offence was committed. In 1353, in the village of Mihavel, southern France, a woman was washing her clothes in the local stream. Leaving the items to dry on a frame, she returned to find that her cloak had been stolen. A young man of 15 was arrested for the crime a few days later. He was found guilty of the theft at court, and he was banished from the village for 3 months. In the London of 1417, a man named Edmund H. Chappell, from the district of Finsbury, was indicted for the robbery of a horse, 4 bolts of cloth, and some other goods. He was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to hang. The crimes are quite similar, but the punishments are worlds apart. It would seem that there were huge variations in what penalties were deemed appropriate depending on the location. In 1321, the Warrant family were making a nuisance of themselves in the rural village of Saul in Norfolk, England. Firstly, 3 of the siblings, sisters Marjorie and Matilda, along with brother Richard, were accused of stealing goods. They managed to evade punishment along with another sister who was accused of theft later in the same year. However, a 5th family member named John was found guilty of stealing clothes and other goods worth 8 shillings from a neighbour. At a time when the average labourer was earning 3 pennies a day, 8 shillings was worth, on average, a month's wages. It would seem that the Warrants were making a considerable living from their illegal activities. Unfortunately, stealing anything worth over 12 pence was seen as a serious crime, and John was hanged. Undeterred by the fate of their relative, the Warrants were back in trouble with the law again in 1325. This time, all 4 of the siblings were behind bars to await trial for stealing cloth worth 60 shillings, and the jailer was specifically instructed to inflict them with fort et dure, or strong and hard treatment, which probably meant some form of torture. But working together again, they managed to escape conviction when put before a jury. The following year, they were at it again. In February, the family were indicted for the theft of 32 cloths, and in August, the 2 sisters were accused of stealing another 40 shillings worth. They were all acquitted on both occasions. There is no way of knowing how many other crimes the family committed, or how they kept getting away with it when they were brought before a court. We can only assume that they either gave up their life of crime or were never caught again, because they disappeared into the mists of medieval obscurity. It is surprising that the family was never actually convicted of any crimes, especially when we consider that the guilt of a suspect on trial in the Middle Ages was usually dependent on the reputation and character of the prisoner, rather than evidence. Trials were very quick affairs, without the lengthy questioning of witnesses and drawn-out deliberations that we see today. Corruption. In 1249, some merchants from the Belgian province of Brabant complained to King Henry III that they had been robbed whilst conducting business in the county of Hampshire. Hampshire was a busy, thriving place, being home to the port of Southampton and the Palace of Winchester. The suspects were caught, put on trial, but acquitted. However, the merchants persisted in their complaint. King Henry took instruction from his councillors and was not happy to find that attacks on travellers were common in Hampshire. And there was a conspiracy to hide the crime from the justices, which involved jurors who were actually accomplices of the robbers. It seems that corruption was a huge problem, and many gangs had links to the rich and powerful, including knights and members of the nobility. The dishonesty went right to the very top. In 1350, Sir William Thorpe, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, was jailed for accepting bribes. Perhaps this is why the Warrants were never convicted, and why jury after jury found them innocent, despite their previous form and bad reputation. It's possible that they were involved in a conspiracy and sharing their stolen money with the very jurors who were deciding their fate. Finding sanctuary. Of course, if you were a convicted criminal and you could make it to a church, you could always claim sanctuary. In medieval Europe, the most common crimes for which a fugitive would seek sanctuary were theft and murder. Once the outlaw was inside a cathedral or church, they were safe, as their pursuers were forbidden to enter by law. The felon could even take a bow and arrow or any other weapon into the church to attack their pursuers from the windows. Once safe inside, the hope was that an agreement might be reached with the injured party and the offender would be given safe passage to leave. Unlike most European churches where a person could only stay in sanctuary for 40 days, for the English there was no limit. In 12th century England, anyone claiming sanctuary had to go into permanent exile from their country and could only return if given a royal pardon. Sanctuary followed by exile was better than going to prison. The food inside jail was bad and scarce, and disease was rife. Not many made it out alive. There were severe penalties for anyone who broke the laws of sanctuary. In 1284, Ralph of Aldgate was out walking with his mistress Alice at Bow, when a goldsmith named Lawrence Duquette insulted her and called her a fallen woman. Ouch. The two men began to fight, and Ralph was badly injured. Fearing that he would die, Lawrence fled to the church of St. Mary le Bow nearby. Ralph actually survived, but Lawrence was later found hanging inside the church. Believing he had committed suicide because of guilt, his body was cut down and he was thrown into a ditch to rot. But a witness came forward who was hiding inside the church and had seen Alice and a group of Ralph's friends enter St. Mary's and lynch Lawrence, hanging him from one of the mullions above a window. This was clearly a violation of the conditions of sanctuary, and the perpetrators were punished accordingly. Alice was burnt at the stake, which was the usual method of execution for a murderess, and her 15 male co-conspirators were hanged. Self-killing. The body of poor Lawrence was treated with such contempt because the act of suicide was also seen as a crime. From as early as the 6th century, the Catholic Church viewed it as a form of murder and denied a suicide victim their formal funeral rite. By the 12th century, this so-called self-murder was seen as a crime in civil law as well as in religious law in Europe, because it deprived a feudal lord of one of his chattels. The victim's property and belongings would be confiscated for the king's treasury instead of being given to the suicide's family. In early 15th century France, the law called for the house of a suicide victim to be demolished, his fields burned, and his woods chopped down. As if that wasn't enough, the body of a suicide victim who was seen as nothing but a common criminal would often be tortured. Some would be hanged or dragged through the streets by a horse, and others burned as a warning of the absolute atrocity of self-murder. In England, a suicide was buried at the crossroads with a stake through the heart to pin the corpse to the ground. Bizarrely, it was thought that this would prevent the spirit from returning and causing any more mayhem. If the staking failed to hold the soul, then it would hopefully get confused by the crossroads and choose the wrong road, thereby going off to harass some other village or town. The actual amount of unlawful behaviour that occurred during the Middle Ages is hard to calculate, but as many social mischiefs were also criminalised, such as gambling, scolding, vagrancy, sexual offences, and even eavesdropping, it would seem to be a time when both church and state were trying to gain social control over even the tiniest of wrongdoings. Now, if you think that dentists are terrifying today, then you are completely correct. However, they used to be even more terrifying back in the Middle Ages. Try to imagine it without anaesthetic and with no sophisticated dental tools. Ugh. Any affliction of the teeth meant a trip to the barber surgeon, who was the go-to medical practitioner at the time, or even the blacksmith if no barber was available. It's a common misconception that dental care was poor during the Middle Ages. A lack of medicine and unhygienic conditions made the era a perfect environment for disease and ill health. Surprisingly though, there is a lot of historical evidence to show us that medieval people actually made great efforts to look after their teeth and gums. White, healthy teeth were seen as a sign of beauty, and bad breath was as undesirable as it is today. I hope you're taking notes. Archaeological studies show that only 20% of medieval people had tooth decay compared with an average of 90% during the early 20th century, and this is due to the lack of refined sugar in their diet. Most medieval people couldn't afford sugar and relied on natural sugars like those in honey and fruits for their sweet fix. Their diet was usually high in calcium from dairy, full of vitamins and minerals from vegetables, and high in cereals. Perfect eating habits for low decay and good teeth. In medieval texts, cures for mouth cancer and treatments for tooth whitening are both mentioned, as are false teeth. Now, let's travel back in time, where 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this video. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The Demon Barber Surgeon. Those who were lucky enough to have enough money and had access to a larger university, town or city could take advantage of the advanced medieval dentistry available. peasants had to make do with their own remedies and the skills of a barber surgeon or their own family and friends to help them remove a tooth. Many botched extractions caused the dislodging of other healthy teeth during the process, dislocation of the jaw, the breaking of bones, and severe loss of blood. Barbers not only charged for their brutal treatments, but they also made the victim pay to buy back their own tooth. From the 6th to the 11th centuries, a lot of dentistry was carried out by members of the clergy as they were able to read medical texts. But in 1163, Pope Alexander III, as part of the Council of Tours, banned monks and priests from practicing surgery because the shedding of blood by a holy cleric was thought to be abhorrent and incompatible with their duty to God. Someone had to take over the role, so barber surgeons stepped up to the plate. They had been connected to monasteries for centuries anyway, in their original position as barbers, as the monks regularly needed their hair to be tonsured, which is the religious practice of shaving the top of the head. That's right, monks' hair does not just grow like that. The tools used by barbers for their trade, such as razors and sharp knives, were perfect for surgery. A guild of barbers was begun in France in 1210 and fell into two categories. Surgeons who were educated at the universities and could perform more complicated procedures, and barber surgeons who were specialized in more mundane practices, such as bathing the customer, cutting hair, shaving beards, and giving enemas. They were also sought out for cup therapy, bloodlettings, leeching, limb amputation when there was no other option, and of course, dentistry. Some barbers even travelled with armies during times of war to help with the wounded and keep the soldiers in good shape. The Toothworm. From as early as 500 BCE, writings from the Sumerians depict toothworms as a cause of tooth decay, and evidence of this belief has also been found in ancient Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and Egyptian civilizations. This idea was still upheld during the Middle Ages. Cavities and tooth decay were thought to be caused by tiny worms that lived inside teeth, as well as an imbalance in the humours. It was believed that the worms would come out at night to eat any food that had been left on the teeth. Then they would burrow back inside the tooth before the person woke up. Gilbertus Anglicus discusses disease of the mouth and teeth in chapters 6 and 7 of his Compendium of Medicine, which was written in 1240. He believed that tooth pain without any swelling was caused by some sort of worm, and he recommended inhaling the smoke from burnt henbane seeds as a cure. A Flemish surgeon named Jan Peurman, who lived in the 14th century, said that rotten humours resulted in holes in the teeth where, quote, worms are growing in the jaw. When those worms lay still, the teeth do not hurt, but if they are moving, then it hurts. He recommended plugging the cavity with a red-hot needle. This treatment probably did work as it would have killed the nerve cells and stopped the toothache, although it would not stop the tooth from rotting, so the patient would likely have to return at a later date for an extraction. A clever business idea. Peurman also advocated only pulling out loose teeth because if they were still stuck, it resulted in a fatal outcome where he explained, "Many have died." The English physician John of Gaddesden learned his craft from studying books. His cures for toothache were mainly based on folk medicine and the use of charms. He states that some say the beak of a magpie hung from the neck cures pain in the teeth. He also suggests that dried cow dung or green tree frog fat can be used to make bad teeth fall out, and that you should stab a needle into a worm which rolls up in a ball when you touch it, and then touch the bad tooth with the same needle to ease the pain. Other recipes called for ants' eggs and newts. Despite his obvious ineptitude, Gaddesden became court physician to King Edward II of England. The first book that concentrated solely on dentistry wasn't written until the 16th century. The first written in the English language was in 1685 called Operator for the Teeth by Charles Allen. Nevertheless, Guy de Chauliac was a renowned French physician and surgeon. He wrote a medical guide to medicine and surgery in 1363 whilst he was physician to the Pope at Avignon, France. He also believed that worms caused tooth decay, stating that when an extraction is done and worms are found in the hole, then pastilles made from onion, henbane seeds, crushed pellitory, and goat fat should be sucked. In China, an amalgam of silver and liquid mercury was used for fillings from as early as the 8th century. But Guy recommended that cavities should be filled with myrrh, camel, pig fat, gallnuts, beeswax, and even sulfur and arsenic. As well as extractions, cancer of the mouth could be treated with sharp tools. Cancerous tissue would be cut out and then the wound would be cauterized with a red-hot instrument. The wound could then be sealed with egg yolk. Guy was one of the first writers to mention the necessity of dental tools, advocating the use of razors, knives, pliers, and files, among other fun-sounding instruments. He invented one of the first tools designed for tooth extraction, a device known as the pelican, which was used right up until the late 1700s, when the equally horrific dental key was invented. The pelican's shape resembled the beak of the bird, hence the name. Usually made from metal, the operative was able to loosen a tooth from its socket by using tremendous leverage. The tooth was pulled out sideways, the process being very painful, and the gums were often damaged during the procedure. Forceps were also commonly used for extraction. Pelicans and forceps, and most other dentistry tools, would have been made by the local blacksmith. Guy advocated securing loose teeth with gold wire or chain. However, he did state that false teeth could be made if all else failed, and suggested that dentures could be fashioned from either human teeth or cowbone. Another crude instrument used by the barber surgeon was called the dental mouth gag. Tetanus, also known as lockjaw, is a particularly nasty infection that causes the muscles of the jaw and neck to contract, preventing the mouth from opening properly. Of course, we now have vaccines to prevent tetanus infection, which can be very dangerous, but in the Middle Ages there was no cure, only treatment for the symptoms. The mouth gag had jaws that were slipped into the mouth of the patient. Nuts were then tightened, which caused the instrument to widen, forcing the mouth to open. It was a very painful procedure, which would, unsurprisingly, likely cause future problems with the jaw. A right royal pain. In the 15th century, King James VI of Scotland was known as a skilled carpenter, barber, and dentist. It seems that he was quite enthusiastic about his hobbies, going so far as paying his subjects so that they would let him bleed them and extract their teeth. One 15th century English king who suffered from chronic toothache was Edward V. Sometimes he had to be confined to bed for months on end because his mouth was so badly corrupted. It is known that Edward's last attack of infection was just before his uncle Richard III had him and his brother imprisoned in the Tower of London. In a document written by the French Emperor Charlemagne during his 8th century reign, he recommends which medicinal plants should be used for problems with the teeth. He was following the works of Theophrastus, a Greek botanist and philosopher. According to him, most of the products used as oral remedies could be mixed with almond oil, which acted as a carrier. Cinnamon was useful for abscesses and infections, hyoscyamus for its pain-killing qualities. Lesions on the gum could be caused by scurvy, and it was recommended that the hedgerow plant, Alexander's, could relieve this problem. Black pepper was used to help with cavities, rose petals were crushed to make a mouthwash, and of course poppies were recommended for their soothing effects. As no real anesthetics, as we know them today, were available, it was just recommended that a patient get blackout drunk before an extraction. Please do check with your dentist before doing this. During the 12th century, an extraordinary set of 3 texts known as the Trotula was written in Salerno, Italy. The writings covered the conditions known to affect women and their treatments, as well as a treatise on how to develop and maintain a woman's beauty. One of the 3 texts was attributed to a female physician known as Trota of Salerno. A beauty tip included in the Trotula describes how to make black teeth white by taking, quote, 10 drams of roasted pumice, 10 drams of salt, some honey, cinnamon, and cloves. The mixture should be heated up until burned and then rubbed on the teeth. Another recommends that a woman should, quote, wash her mouth after dinner with a very good wine, then dry her teeth well and wipe them with a new white cloth to render them very white. Finally, she should chew fennel or lovage of parsley each day because it gives off a good smell and cleans good gums. Other early forms of tooth whitening included using aqua fortis, which was diluted nitric acid. This whitened the teeth, but unfortunately also ate away at the enamel and destroyed them. So, as you brush your teeth tonight, just remember what our ancestors went through at the dentist and be thankful that you don't have to worry about the sickening toothworm. In a previous episode, we looked at the diet of a medieval peasant. However, if this wasn't quite to your taste, then you can join us today whilst we look at the food of the upper classes of the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. For the people of the Middle Ages, everything was just about rank. That's rank as in status, not disgusting. Even the type of food that the nobility ate was regarded as a status symbol. The gap between the social classes and their foodstuffs was incomparable. A person's place in society dictated what they ate, so the diets of peasants, artisans, and merchants were greatly different from the meals of the ruling classes. Always at the centre of medieval life was the Catholic Church, and it strictly enforced fasting days when meat could not be eaten. Eating meat was associated with carnal desires, and an over-interest in promiscuity. So all kinds of fish were eaten on feast days such as bream, eel, salmon, and cod. Pike was extremely expensive and was served only on special occasions. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and sometimes Saturdays were fast days. Later, fish was allowed on these days, as was fruit, bread, and vegetables. Lent was particularly hard with fasting, lasting for 40 days with no meat, eggs, or dairy. So even the wealthiest people did not normally eat meat every day. In fact, fast days accounted for half the days of the year. In the early Middle Ages, Pope Gregory I railed against the sin of gluttony, describing it as, quote, eating between meals, seeking out delicacies to satisfy the vile sense of taste, looking for sauces and seasonings to excite the palate, and eating more than was necessary. With the rise of the middle classes during the 12th century, sumptuary laws were enacted to control the spending of the new rich. Philip IV of France banned his subjects from having any more than one main dish and one side dish per meal. And in England from 1363, those of lower rank were only allowed one meal of meat or fish a day. Sugar and spice. Known as sweet salt, sugar was introduced to Europe when the Crusaders returned from the Holy Lands. Its cultivation spread, and in the 1300s Venice set up estates at some villages in Tyre for sugar production and export to the rest of Europe. As well as using the common herbs such as parsley, sage, and thyme, the upper classes had spices imported from Africa and Asia, as these were also a symbol of affluence. Cinnamon, pepper, saffron, nutmeg, ginger, and other exotic spices were used extensively in food preparation, but they were also passed around at banquets on a spice platter. Guests were encouraged to take additional spice from the platter to sprinkle over their food. Spices were also added to wines and were so highly valued that they were given as gifts. During the late Middle Ages, about 1,000 tons of spice and 1,000 tons of pepper were imported into Western Europe every year. The money spent would have fed 1.5 million people with grain for a year. There actually was a special section in the royal kitchens called a spicery, which was completely dedicated to the art. In fact, one of the most important places in a medieval house were the kitchens for the management, storage, and preparation of food. There would have been a buttery, pantry, cellar, and larder, as well as a confectionery and a saucery. Spicy sauces were very popular, such as the recipe for cameline sauce, which was invented by the French cook Taillevent. It included red Burgundy wine, vinegar, cinnamon, ginger, and other assorted spices. Taillevent included this recipe in his famous cookbook La Viandière, which he wrote at the end of the medieval period. He was the cook for several kings of France, as well as the Duke of Normandy during the 1400s. Banquets. The competition between household hierarchies and the status of the guests was easily seen here. The most important people, including the lord or baron, would sit at one end of the room on a raised platform. They would be seated at a table side by side, facing the other guests who would sit on chairs and stools at trestle tables further down the hall. Salt was rare and expensive. It would be placed at the centre of the high table, as only those important enough were allowed to use it. The container or salt cellar, often called a nef, which was used to hold the condiment, would be highly decorative, sometimes in the shape of a ship to reflect the importance that salt was given. Those on the lower tables were said to be sitting below the salt. The prestige of the host would be judged by the exclusivity and quantity of the food provided, while the order that the diners were served in, and both the amount and rarity of the food served to them, also showed their social rank. Those lower in the status were given less of the finer quality ingredients and smaller quantities. The lord would always be served first, and there were courtesy books that laid down the rules for proper conduct when eating at the table. One such book, printed by William Caxton in the 15th century, states that one should, quote, "speak little, not burp or fart, or pare your nails, or pick your teeth at the table, or lean on it," amongst other things. Hands were washed before the meal, and because the host was not required to provide knives, guests often brought their own. In the 11th century, the Italian nobleman Domenico Selvo brought his Greek wife back to Central Europe. Her use of a fork for eating was regarded as scandalous and heretical. The squires of the kitchen had the job of choosing, purchasing, and paying for the food provisions. The dishes for the feast would be made by the cooks in the kitchen. In the most elite households there was usually more than one cook, and then placed on dressers by the squires until it was time for service in the Great Hall. The dishes were served on plates made from pewter or gold and silver in the finest of households. There could be anything up to 6 courses, and the meal would begin with bread, which was always served with every meal. A nobleman would have eaten white bread, made every day in his own kitchen, rather than the rough brown rye bread eaten by the peasantry. The more prominent the household was, then the finer and whiter the bread would be. Some elite households may even have had their own mill and produced their own flour. Only nobles were allowed to hunt game and fish on their estates, so there would be a variety of freshly killed game meat for the tables, such as wild boar, venison, hares and rabbits, or wild fowl like pheasant and partridge, as well as the more domesticated animals such as chickens, geese, pigs and duck. Many types of bird were roasted and eaten, such as quail, cranes and larks, and other songbirds depending on the season. But swans and storks were only eaten by the elite, although they were usually displayed as a lavish centerpiece rather than eaten for their meat. Vegetables would have also been seasonal and probably picked from the lord's own garden. Cabbage and leeks were popular, but parsnips, peas, carrots, turnips, onions, broad beans and various squashes would also have been available. Many estates would have orchards providing fresh produce such as apples, pears and plums. Raw fruit and vegetables were thought to cause disease, so they were always served cooked. Expensive dried fruits and nuts would also make it to the noble's table. Raisins, figs, dates and almonds were highly sought after in Central and Northern Europe and imported, as were Mediterranean fruits such as oranges and grapes. The royal appetite. The feasts held for members of the royalty were of course extremely lavish affairs. The coronation banquet of Henry IV is said to have consisted of 3 courses. But it should be noted that courses in the Middle Ages were not served like they are today with a starter, main and dessert. Dishes that were brought out to the guests were a random assortment and only consistent in that they offered a great deal of choice. The food was meant to be a form of entertainment in itself, with enough variety so that the guests could pick and choose whatever they liked and discount some dishes entirely. There would be an interval of music or some sort of performance between each course, and each one that was presented came with a sugar sculpture known as a subtlety, which was completely decorative. Each carving was made to represent some form of religious symbolism, such as an angel or a saint. Only those of great wealth could afford to use sugar in this way, for looking at rather than eating. At a 1387 feast held by the Duke of Lancaster and Richard II, the quantities of food including, among other things, 111 swans, 210 geese, 96 rabbits, 160 pounds of apples, and 12,000 eggs. The Count of Anjou, who was the third son of King Louis II of Sicily, held a great banquet in 1455. The first course was a stag that had been salted overnight, and a quarter of it was served with stuffed chicken, loin of veal, and jugged hare cooked in red wine, spices, and fresh herbs. 2 dishes were smothered in a German sauce and had pomegranate seeds and sugar plums which were covered in gold leaf. 3 further courses consisted of a roe deer, a sturgeon braised in vinegar and parsley and dusted with powdered ginger and a whole pig, chickens and pigeons, a dozen of each, 6 baby rabbits and a baby goat, 2 goslings, a stuffed capon, 2 herons and a leveret, 4 chickens were smothered in egg yolks then dusted with spice, and a wild boar was covered with wafers and stars, and a partridge in a pear tree. This was followed by a cream sprinkled with sugar and fennel seeds, slices of cheese, strawberries and a red and white jelly which represented the crests of the attending guests. Finally, there were plums soaked in rosewater. The 5th and final course comprised entirely of fashionable wines and preserves made from fruit, as well as numerous types of sweet pastries. Of course, other drinks such as ale or mead were available, but wine was chosen by the medieval nobility because it created a division between them and the lower classes, giving them the appearance of sophistication. Wine was also thought to keep the humours in balance, lift the spirit and aid both digestion and the colour of the complexion. Obviously, Henry would have wanted to serve a beverage that was held in great esteem and displayed his wealth. There was always some sort of theatrical showpiece at a high-ranking banquet, and this one was no exception. The centerpiece represented a green garden and was surrounded by branches and peacock feathers. Aromatic flowers were tied to the branches. A silver-gilded mini-fortress was placed in the middle of the lawn, which acted as a large cage for several live birds with gilt feet. On each corner of the lawn was a huge pie, topped with smaller pies to form the shape of a crown. The pies were gilded in silver and gold, naturally, and they also contained a whole roe deer, chickens, pigeons, rabbits, minced veal, 2 pounds of fat, and 26 boiled eggs sprinkled with saffron and studded with cloves. It's no surprise then that obesity was very common amongst the nobility of the Middle Ages, with many consuming 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, more than double what was actually needed. The smock, hose, kirtle, dress, belt, surcoat, girdle, cape, hood, and bonnet are just some examples of the more standard medieval clothing. However, fashion trends did sometimes get a little ridiculous too. So, strap your Gucci boxers tight as we travel back in time to look at fashion during the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Just as it does today, fashion and necessity dictated what the people wore during the Middle Ages. Cultural traditions were wide-ranging across Europe and Asia, as were the materials available. Fashions would depend on the century that the man or woman lived in, where they lived, and what their position was in society. Obviously, a 15th century Venetian's clothes would look nothing like those of a 7th century Viking. Fashions did change quite slowly. Today we find some of the trends that were popular in the Middle Ages quite silly, such as the 18-inch chopine, platform shoes of the Italian aristocracy, or the canonical hennin headdresses, similar to a Turkish fez that could reach heights of up to 4 feet, as well as the ridiculously long sleeved dresses and the men's chokingly skin-tight hoods. For the most part, clothing was made of 3 main materials: linen, wool, and silk. These were all manufactured in a range of different weights. The finer the weave, then the more expensive and softer the material was likely to be. Fabrics such as taffeta and velvet were made for the wealthier wearer and were not available until the later medieval period. Leather was used for an assortment of accessories such as shoes and belts, as well as armor. After the 10th century, fur became fashionable as a sign of status. Before this time, it was thought too vulgar to wear because of its use by barbarians. Everything from ermine, fox, rabbit, and squirrel were used for both warmth and luxury. Dyes were made from various materials such as crushed insects, tree bark, nuts, plants, iron oxide, roots, lichen, and even mollusks. The adding of colour meant extra work for the manufacturer, raising costs so that the poorer peasants were only able to wear undyed fabrics of muted colours. The brightest and most expensive dyes were reserved for the nobility and royalty. Although the natural dye woad, made from a flowering plant, produced a dark blue dye and was used extensively by every class of society. The early Middle Ages. Fashion changed quite slowly between the 5th and 12th centuries. The men of this period usually wore a tunic and some form of legging. The basic T-shaped tunic would have sleeves and a hole for the neck, and the length of the tunic would depend upon the man's occupation or social status. Soldiers and peasants would wear them at knee length or shorter so that they were not hindered in their daily work, and they were made from coarse wool. In warmer climates, trousers might not be worn at all. The most basic leg coverings were just strips of cloth worn around the leg and tied on with long laces. Richer men wore their tunics longer, and although they did use wool and linen in their clothing, they were of a finer texture than those worn by the common man. Silk was only used for the clothing of the nobility and was usually brought in from the Byzantine Empire, as only the elite were able to afford the costs involved with importing luxury goods from outside of Europe. Cotton was also brought in from Egypt and other countries of the East. Sometimes these tunics would fall all the way to the floor and were extravagantly embellished. Charles the Bold of Burgundy liked to wear cloth of gold as the ultimate status symbol. Many of his subjects found that keeping up with the fashions of his court ruined them financially. In Western Europe, a cloak or mantle was sometimes thrown over the shoulders, especially in winter. This served the same purpose as an overcoat. The Germanic people wore a waist-length cape known as a say, which would be secured on the left shoulder with decorative jewellery items such as shoulder pins or brooches known as fibulas. This was so the right arm could move freely when handling a sword. Many of these brooches were highly ornate and were made from gold or silver for those with status and money. Other decorative items such as belts, buckles, and metal purses were also worn by the elite during the early Middle Ages. The significant influence of the church ruled society during the time, so it's not surprising that women always wore some type of head covering in public, to naturally preserve modesty. A simple veil would be held on by a headband or circlet. No respectable woman would be seen out without one, as it was seen as a temptation to good men. Going outside without covering her hair, a woman would leave herself open to suspicion and gossip. In the French town of Arles, if an honest woman saw a prostitute wearing a veil, she was legally entitled to rip it off. Women usually wore a simple full-length tunic-like dress with sleeves. There would be a slit on the bodice so that the tunic could be easily put on and taken off. The slit was held together with lacing, normally from a narrow strip of leather or strong fabric. Headwear. Peasants in the fields wore straw hats to protect them from the sun, and this remained unchanged throughout the centuries. Men also wore chaperons, which were a hood and cape all in one piece, and were first worn before the beginning of the 13th century. Sometimes the cape was scalloped for decoration, and the hood would end in a pointed tail. They were worn by both men and women of the lower classes in northern Europe, made from wool for warmth in the winter and linen for shade in the warmer months. Eventually, this hooded cape evolved into a hat with a loose tail hanging from the back before becoming a padded circular hat. Wimples were worn mostly by married women from the 10th to the 14th centuries, which covered the head, neck, and chin. Later, as well as the circlet and veil, a narrow chin strap called a barbette became common. This style of headdress might also have mesh hairnets on either side of the head. By the end of the Middle Ages, the tall headdress known as a hennin was in vogue. It was worn at a 45-degree angle at the back of the head. The very long steeple hennin was only popular in Europe for about 50 years before it was succeeded by the more practical low hoods and caps. Shoes. Shoes were worn by all classes, even the very poor who wore simple turn shoes made from leather. The basic design and style of shoes remained the same throughout the medieval period. For the richer buyer, better quality materials and finer details were added. The leather could be decorated with cutwork patterns or stamping. They were popular with both sexes. For the nobility and royalty, shoes were gilded or studded with pearls and jewels. By the 12th century, pointed shoes were becoming popular. In England, they became known as krakows or polanes by the late 1300s because of the influence of King Richard II's Polish wife. Over the years, the length became more and more exaggerated, and by the 15th century, some had toes up to 24 inches long. They were stuffed with all sorts of materials to keep their shape, such as moss, hair, wool, or grass. These shoes were frowned upon by the church because of their phallic shape and were very impractical. Warriors had to cut off the points of their polanes before going into battle. Overshoes called pattens were worn over the top of normal shoes for protection from mud and sewage on the streets. They were usually made from wood or cork, had leather laces to tie them on, and were worn by both men and women. Indoors, slippers or pinsons were worn and were often fur-lined for warmth and comfort. Sumptuary laws. Because of the improvement of wages and living standards after the Black Death, laws were brought in to stop the lower classes from dressing like their social superiors. Sumptuary laws attempted to limit the people from buying luxury items of food, clothing, and furniture. The laws of 1363 limited the types of fur and fabric that could be worn. At one time, the tall hennin headdress was banned for wear by the lower classes, although they were completely impractical for performing tasks anyway. It was judged that any woman with an income less than £10 was banned from wearing them. The toe length on shoes was also limited. In London, only the nobility could wear shoes with toes longer than 2 inches. And in 1463, purple, royal blue, and crimson-dyed clothing was restricted. From 1483 in England, the wearing of fabrics such as velvet, satin brocade, and cloth of gold was limited to knights and lords, as was the wearing of furs, ermine, and sable. If a yeoman or an esquire of the crown had an income of at least £40 a year, then he could wear satin or damask. The High and Late Middle Ages. Now European fashions began to change at a much faster pace, especially for women. The Crusades and the exploration of other continents by adventurers such as Marco Polo introduced new styles from other cultures. The spinning wheel and horizontal loom made the production of textiles much simpler. Increased production meant an improvement of trade as beautiful clothing became more affordable. Tunics became tighter for both sexes. Women's gowns became fitted from the shoulder to below the waist. Longer sleeves widened to a bell shape and were sometimes so long that they touched the ground. Being fitted around the body, with armholes that were far too tight and with sleeves that were too long, the 12th and 13th century clothing was uncomfortable and awkward to wear. This trend for tighter clothing inspired men to keep a slim physique. Men wore linen breeches and shirts as undergarments with woolen hose to cover the legs. On top of the shirt, a buttoned doublet was worn, which would often have a skirting or pleating at the hem. Slashes were made in the sleeves, which showed the undertunic beneath. This was pulled through to produce billows of contrasting colour and fabric. By the 14th century, a noblewoman's outfit consisted of several layers. A chemise of fine linen next to the skin, then a fitted gown or kirtle was worn over that, a sideless surcoat might be put on over that to show the garment beneath, and another more voluminous one might be added for travel, as well as a cloak. Top layers, necklines, hems and sleeves may have been trimmed with appliqued silks or embroidery. Tablet weaving was also used as a garment trim, as well as for straps and belts. Buttons now became functional instead of just for decoration only, and handkerchiefs became fashionable. Noble women also wore jewelled girdles and carried small purses that they hung from their belts. The houppelande became popular in Europe during the late medieval period. It was an outer garment for both men and women. It consisted of very wide sleeves and a high collar. The excess of cloth at the back of the robe hung down and dragged on the floor behind the wearer. The houppelande was often completely lined with expensive fur, and its edges would be cut into decorative shapes. The long legal and academic robes that are still worn today evolved from this garment. As the era known as the Middle Ages came to an end, trade and technology advanced quickly. Beginning in Italy, Western Europe moved into a time of both cultural and artistic awakening known as the Renaissance, where fashions would only become more and more ostentatious. Are you sick of hospital waiting times in the modern day? Well, we can't help with that. We're just a YouTube channel. However, we can make things seem a little less grim. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at hospitals and healthcare in the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The medievals had three types of hospitals. The first, known as the Leprosaria, for those afflicted with leprosy. The second were those erected for the general use of pilgrims and sick travellers, and the third were intended to give shelter to the elderly. A lot were a mixture of the three types, and all were used to look after the needs of the poor, where the inmates would receive care and possibly some rudimentary forms of treatment. Only the rich would have been able to afford the expertise of a trained physician or surgeon, and they would have been treated in their own homes. Poor sick people would have used the skills of local healers and herbalists, as well as the domestic cures passed on to them from female relatives. In England, over 700 hospitals were established in the 500 years between the Norman conquest and the middle of the 16th century. Many dominated the landscape and were built with a lot of care and a considerable amount of investment. One of the largest in the north of England was St Leonard's Hospital in York. As is the case with most of these once imposing medieval buildings, sadly St Leonard's is now just a ruin. As most of these large hospitals were indistinguishable from monasteries having their own chapels, they became victims of the Reformation and were destroyed. Subsequently, this left York without a hospital from the time of Henry VIII until the middle of the 18th century. At the height of its power, St Leonard's had 200 beds, giving it a capacity for 400 inmates. Beds were shared by patients of the same gender, and it also served as a children's home, housing 23 boys. There was a whole army of staff that helped to run the hospital, including bakers, brewers, and cooks, as well as 16 servants. The healing power of prayer. Religion took dominance over everything else in the Middle Ages, and because of this, the appearance and purpose of a medieval hospital was very different from what we expect today. From the year 1215, admission to any hospital was not allowed unless the patient had first confessed all of their sins. Sin was thought to cause disease, so the medievals thought there was no point in trying to treat any physical symptoms until the soul had been cleansed. The health of the soul took priority over that of the body, and prayer for recovery was as important as any other treatment. The benefactors who had paid for the building of the house also had to be prayed for every day. Each patient at the St Andrew's Hospital in Canterbury had to recite 300 Ave Marias, Credos, and Pater Nostras daily to save their patrons' souls. Anne of Bohemia, the wife of King Richard II, even had her coat of arms embossed on the ceiling of the great hospital in Norwich, so that just in case they forgot, as they rested there and looked up, each patient would remember who it was that had paid for the bed they were lying in. So in essence, hospitals were a religious building. Built in the shape of a cross, there would be an altar in each wing, that way the patients could see the celebration of Mass at all times. And many were decorated with rich Christian imagery, so that the sick could meditate and cleanse their souls. Music also played an important part in the medieval healing process. At the Hospital of St Giles in Norwich, sung masses and other prayers were performed throughout the day. Physicians studied music as part of their training, and it was thought to regulate the heart rate and lift the mood. The ceilings of these institutions were designed to be lofty, as disease was thought to spread by noxious air, known as miasma. The idea was to keep the wards free from dirt and smells as much as possible to avoid any airborne odours that could corrupt the atmosphere. Many hospitals also had piped water supplies for the regular washing of laundry and efficient drainage systems to dispose of waste. Doctors and nurses. In English infirmaries, patients would have been looked after by female nurses rather than a doctor. The nurses would have been mature women. This was so that the nurses would have garnered a considerable amount of experience in all aspects of the management of a hospital, such as cooking, housekeeping, and laundry work. Their maturity was also expected to be a barrier for any sexual shenanigans and scandal with the male patients. Unlike the rest of Europe, the English hospitals of the Middle Ages did not employ the services of any trained surgeons, physicians, or apothecaries. In contrast, by the 14th century, one of the most famous infirmaries in Europe, the Santa Maria Nova in Florence, had an impressive staff. There were 3 junior housemen in residence, 6 senior physicians who visited the hospital daily, several surgeons, a pharmacist, and an ophthalmic specialist. The junior housemen were obliged to train there for a period before they became fully qualified. Many town councils in Europe actually paid medical staff to work in hospitals. It wasn't until the Hospital of the Savoy was founded in London by Henry VII that an English institution finally got a doctor and a surgeon. But this wasn't until the beginning of the 16th century. Leprosaria. Most leper houses were established on the outskirts of towns, outside of the city walls. Not because the lepers needed to be segregated, but because the routes in and out of the cities were busier and therefore better places for the lepers to beg. Leper houses were some of the earliest hospitals, most being built between the 11th and 13th centuries, making up about a quarter of all institutions in England. Many were mixed with a combination of lepers and the elderly. At the Hospital of Buckland by Dover in southern England, lepers had to take an oath before they were admitted, and discipline was strict. Patients had to promise to be, quote, faithful and useful, sober and chaste of body. By the 11th century, leprosy was endemic in England. Leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, is a chronic illness. In the later stages, it can cause a loss of the extremities, blindness, collapse of the nose, gangrene, skin lesions, ulcers, and a weakening of the skeleton. Many believed that the pain and anguish of lepers was similar to that of the suffering of Christ. Lepers were experiencing their purgatory here on earth, meaning that they would ascend directly to heaven. This meant that they were closer to God than others, and that their carers and benefactors would also hasten their journey to heaven by lessening their own time in purgatory. The spiritual health of these patients was a priority, and emphasis was given to comforting sermons that likened their suffering to Christ, hopefully meaning that the lepers would remain humble and accept their fate with humility. Sherburn Hospital in Durham, in the north of England, was founded near the end of the 12th century as a lazar house. It was built to house 65 poor leprose nuns and monks, and was run by 3 priests and a master. The patients were kept clean and were given fresh, nourishing food. Each received a loaf of bread and a gallon of beer daily. They were given meat 3 times a week, and on the days when meat was prohibited, they were offered eggs, cheese, and vegetables. Those who were suffering from nasal and sinus damage were given an appropriate diet. Once a week, 2 women washed the patients' heads and bodies. Linen undergarments were provided for those with ulcerated skin, and special footwear was given to those who had damaged feet. Clothing was washed once a week, and utensils were washed daily. Initially, the patient might be relatively mobile and able to take part in light occupations such as gardening work or looking after livestock. Inevitably though, the sufferer would eventually need full-time care as their condition deteriorated. But, as with Buckland, and even though the inmates were suffering from a horrific illness, discipline was still quite high. Anyone caught being disobedient was first subjected to corporal punishment with a rod before being given a diet of bread and water. If all else failed, they were expelled from the community. Nevertheless, spaces at these leprosariums were at a premium. Lepers weren't forced to go there, they wanted to, and places were sought after. King Edward II asked the bishop that Joan, the widow of John Chamber, be admitted to Sherborne as a personal favour to himself. Chamber had served the king well against the Scots. The General Hospital. These institutions housed a huge variety of patients, usually for short periods of time. Yes, some were dying or had critical illnesses, meaning they were too ill to beg, but many more were just malnourished or exhausted and needed a bed overnight and a decent meal. Many were transient travellers and pilgrims. In the summer months, the roads were packed with people needing somewhere to rest. Other hospitals took in orphaned children and pregnant women, such as the Priory of St Mary Spital, which grew to be the largest in medieval London. Founded by the merchants and run by Augustinian monks, St Mary Spital took on a special responsibility for poor pregnant women for their lying-in period both before and after delivery. Accommodation was provided for them away from the main infirmary. Provision was also made for the upkeep of any children born there until the age of 7 if their mother died in childbirth, which was quite common. In 15th century Florence, 1 in 5 women died whilst giving birth. Unable to look after them themselves, unmarried women often abandoned babies at hospitals. The Santa Maria della Scala in Florence had a turning box set into the wall, so that women could anonymously leave their babies. Wet nurses resided in the hospital to feed the infants of these baby deposit boxes. The care home. Economically, the Black Death left the general population of England with a much better standard of living. If you'd like some more information on this, we have just released a documentary on the Black Death on this channel. As a consequence of this better standard of living, those who had survived the pandemic lived for much longer. But at the same time, many of the children of these aging survivors had died, and there was no longer anyone to look after them. The answer in the late medieval period was to house the infirm, disabled, and elderly in the Middle Ages equivalent of sheltered accommodation. There, both their social and spiritual needs could be catered for in a place that attended to the patient's warmth, diet, cleanliness, and spiritual serenity. The medievals were in fact quite forward-thinking in their view that improving anxiety and mental health would improve many types of illness. Taking this holistic approach, they were following the ideas of the ancient Greeks and revising them to suit their Christian beliefs. The standards of care in medieval hospitals were mixed and differed from place to place. Many had a mixture of inmates and had to adapt over time as they responded to the changes in social needs over the period. In a time before antibiotics, vaccines, and anesthetics, the main purpose of the medieval hospital was to look after the poor, the sick, and the old. For the last days of a medieval whose greatest wish was to die in the church, hospitals helped them to die well. It was less about curing and more about caring. In 1381, the peasants were revolting. Truly disgusting. On an unrelated topic, there was actually a Peasants Revolt in 1381. It began in Essex as a response to the harsh economic demands of Parliament and was one of the most significant uprisings in Europe during the medieval period. A national movement of people that spread as far as York and Scarborough in the northeast and over to Somerset in the southwest of England. Previous uprisings had always been led by noblemen, ambitious to overthrow the out-of-touch government and seize power for themselves. This time it was different. The so-called Peasants Revolt was led by a group of commoners, men like Wat Tyler, John Ball, and Jack Straw. A group of men and women from all walks of life who wanted to radically change English society rather than seek out personal advancement. Let's travel back in time and try and understand why the peasants revolted in 1381. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The instability of a boy king. King Edward III had died 4 years earlier. His eldest son and heir, the popular Black Prince, died before his father, and so his grandson Richard II had succeeded to the throne instead. But Richard was only 10 years old, just a boy king, leaving him dependent on his uncle John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. The 100 Years' War, which actually went on for 116 years, had been raging since 1337. Tensions between the crowns of England and France over territory went back centuries, with English kings rightly or wrongly making claim to the French throne. This made it a major source of ongoing conflict between the two monarchies, often punctuated by a series of brief periods of peace. Henry V famously won the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 and actually became King of France. By 1381, King Richard was still only 14 years old. Having no official role didn't matter to his uncle John of Gaunt. The authoritarian was unpopular and feared, but now being the eldest surviving son of the late King Edward, he was the most dominant noble in England and the real power behind the throne. Royal authority was dependent on the backing of the English nobility. The House of Lancaster had over 30 castles and a private army of 4,000 men. With Gaunt at its head, it therefore had great sway over the governance of the kingdom. The Church. The influence of the Church was everywhere, dominating daily life. Their magnificent buildings overshadowed both town and country. All citizens were legally obligated to give 1/10 of their wealth to the Church, either in cash from their wages or by rent in kind from grain, wool, or other goods. The Church also demanded extra payments too, such as on feast days or for mortuary fines when a parishioner died. All of this money had made the Church very wealthy, with some abbots and bishops living extravagant and immoral lifestyles. In the late 14th century, this caused all parts of English society to question the Church's position and whether it should relinquish its wealth. But the courtiers around young King Richard, including his mother and John of Gaunt, protected the Church. Whether this was because they genuinely believed in its sanctity or because they wanted a contribution towards the war effort is debatable. Taxes and wars. The Black Death had arrived in England in 1348, wiping out up to half of the population, leaving death, devastation, and a time of real social upheaval in its wake. Many of those who survived found that their financial circumstances much improved. A shortage of manpower created greater opportunities for those at the bottom of the social ladder, who were able to demand higher wages, negotiate better terms of employment, and even purchase more land. But the government brought in sumptuary laws to not only bar labourers from getting higher wages, but also to stop them wearing high-quality clothing and restrict their diet. Despite these restrictions, a new middle class of merchants, artisans, and even farmers were created. An ambitious class that had become numerate and literate, and were enjoying both physical and social mobility. The government, employers, and private landowners all sought to exploit this newfound wealth that had been created by what they believed were their inferiors. The people of England were heavily taxed, and the money collected had been spent on what was now seen as pointless military assaults, which did nothing to improve the lives of the people at home. In the 1370s, a new community tax was brought in that saw a levy on every parish in England and Wales. Areas with the densest population were most severely hit, such as East Anglia. Suffolk saw its contribution increase by a shocking 103%. And then in January of 1377, the government ushered in the first poll tax. Everyone had to pay, the only exceptions being children under 14 and beggars. Now, the people were already becoming restless, but things only got worse. Between the years of 1377 and 1381, 3 poll taxes were brought in that had to be paid regardless of status or wealth. The commissioners that were sent out to enforce these payments were ruthless in taking the money, being told to collect it by all manner ways and means. For the nobleman, the extra levy was relatively painless, but for the ordinary working man, the farmers and tradesmen, it was financially crippling. And as if that wasn't enough, the French were also launching raids on the south coast of England, and the people were becoming increasingly afraid of an invasion. Instability, taxes, church corruption, a failing war, and measures aimed at suppression of the people, it was a perfect storm, and a revolt was inevitable. In London, in the April of 1381, the commissioners were unable to collect the taxes without it causing dangerous agitation amongst the population. Then a collector was attacked in Oxfordshire by a group of assailants. The aptly named William Payable was tortured and beaten. And he wasn't the last. Random outbreaks of resistance began, especially in Kent and the other counties surrounding London, before spreading to East Anglia and beyond. By the beginning of June, the rebels were organising their uprising and preparing to move on London. Flying the banner of St. George and led by their captain, a man named Wat Tyler, the target of the Kentish rebels was not young King Richard, but rather the faction of noble families around him. On the 2nd of June, the renegades swore allegiance to their king, wanting to save him from the harmful influence of John of Gaunt. The rebellion was quite well organised, and all over the country men travelled on horseback to different settlements spreading news of the rebellion. Groups began to destroy manorial records which chronicled the unfree station of many of the peasants. The leaders. Not much is known about 2 of the revolt's leaders, neither Walter Tyler, although his name is synonymous with the uprising, or his comrade Jack Straw. Both men seem to emerge from complete obscurity, and there is little known about their background or motives. Some historians even argue that the 2 men are the same person, as many of the organisers used pseudonyms. Tyler led the rebels to Canterbury on the 10th of June, there they sacked the Archbishop's palace. Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, was one of King Richard's closest advisors, and responsible for suggesting a new poll tax just the year before. A tax which ensured that the poor paid more than the rich. After destroying documents and freeing prisoners from the jail, the rebels moved on to London and camped on Blackheath on the 12th of June. It was there that John Ball gave one of his most famous sermons on freedom and equality. It's thought that around 30,000 rebels marched onto London. The Lollard priest John Ball had a central role as the spiritual voice of the people. Already imprisoned for his belief in equality, Ball preached his criticism of the lords with their extravagant clothing, fine houses and overindulgence, in contrast to the commoners who were working for the lord's benefit and receiving little in return. Ball whipped up public opinion against those in power and helped to motivate an already agitated populace. After being arrested and imprisoned for sedition, he was released by the rebels as they made their way towards London. On entering the city on the 13th, the rebels caused panic amongst the nobility. King Richard, his mother, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, and other councillors retreated to the Tower of London for safety. The Savoy, John of Gaunt's luxury palace, unrivaled in splendour and nobility, was razed to the ground. But the Duke of Lancaster was lucky to be in Scotland negotiating a truce, and escaped with his life. At only 14 years old, and against the advice of his council, Richard met with Tyler and the rebels. At the first meeting outside the city walls at Mile End, he promised them a charter of liberties including the abolition of forced labour, cheap land, and free trade. Taking advantage of the king's absence, other rebels broke into the tower. It's a mystery how they got into the heavily fortified castle, but they were probably let in by sympathisers. After capturing Chancellor Sudbury and the Lord High Treasurer Robert Hales, they were taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, was lucky. He managed to escape capture and later went on to seize the throne for himself, becoming King Henry IV. With his uncle bargaining with the Scots and his armies spread out across Wales, France and Scotland, King Richard II, fearing for his life, spent the night in hiding. Despite his fear, Richard rode out to meet Tyler and his rebels again the next day, at Smithfield, a large open area outside of the city walls. Tyler was brought before the king. When asked why they would not go home, Tyler replied that they had further concessions and would not leave until they were met. There is confusion as to what happened next, but there was an altercation between Tyler and the Lord Mayor of London, and Tyler was attacked and killed. Many of the rebels began to ready their weapons, but the young king galloped towards the protesters shouting, "I am your leader," and demanded that they left the field immediately. Unbelievably, Richard was able to talk the crowd down, the mob dispersed, and the uprising was crushed. The legacy. As we all know, the Peasants Revolt of 1381 has created a world without such barbaric laws where the rich get richer and the poor stay poor. Just kidding. Richard was unable to keep his promises due to his limited power in Parliament. He claimed he had made them under duress, and they were therefore not valid anyway. Those named as ringleaders were executed. Although the poll tax was revoked, the peasants were forced to return to their earlier lives controlled by either lord or church. Not for the first time did the ordinary people of England learn how foolish it was to trust their rulers. John Ball fled to Coventry but was arrested. At trial he was found guilty, and unwilling to repent of his treason, he was hanged, drawn and quartered on the 15th of July in St Albans, whilst Richard watched. Nicknamed the Mad Priest of Kent, his head was displayed on London Bridge, along with that of Wat Tyler, whose body was publicly decapitated and his head was carried on top of a pole through the city first. Although the rebels' demands were not met, some historians believe that the Peasants' Revolt is a defining moment in our history. Over 60,000 people are thought to have been involved in the rebellion. By November of that year, over 1,500 rebels were killed, including its leaders. But in just over 1 month, this resolute band of people had fought for the rights of the working man, for freedom and equality, fundamental principles that are at the heart of every democracy. Before we dive into today's episode, it's worth reminding ourselves of the huge political and social advancements of the last century that allow us to look back and condemn the incredibly evil and inhumane atrocities of the past. Only by looking back can we see how far we've come towards building a world that is safe and accepting of everyone. Throughout history, there have always been people who belong to the LGBTQ community. In antiquity, same-sex relations were common, and it was acceptable for men to have both male and female lovers outside of marriage. Regarded as a way of controlling the population, Plato compared the acceptance of homosexuality to democracy and its repression to tyranny. Both the terms heterosexuality and homosexuality were not created until the 19th century, and there was no understanding of these terms in the Middle Ages. No one in medieval Europe would have referred to themselves, or anyone else, as gay, straight, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual. There was only normal and what they deemed abnormal sexual behaviour, and what was normal was decided by the Christian Church at that time. For the most part, there aren't many historical resources during the Middle Ages about same-sex relationships between women, although any sort of sex that did not result in conception was known as sodomy. In fact, the Church was antagonistic to any form of sexual expression at all. Let's travel back in time and look into homosexuality during the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Justinian. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who ruled during the 6th century, had an intense dislike for homosexuality and passed many laws as a consequence. He stated that, quote, certain men were seized by the most disgraceful lusts and acts contrary to nature. He blamed homosexuals for floods and earthquakes, not unlike the Christian right today, who claimed that natural disasters are the wrath of God because of lesbians and gay men. He also recommended cruel and violent punishments that were particularly directed at men and included mutilation of the genitals. The people of Constantinople suffered greatly during the 6th century. The bubonic plague wiped out 40% of its population, and it was also rocked by several earthquakes, causing even more fatalities. What Justinian needed to succeed in his military conquests were young, fit fighters for his army. This could only be achieved with a rapid growth of the population, and same-sex couples could not procreate. Sodomy. Church condemnation of homosexuality actually started to appear again in the 11th century after the Codex Justinianus. A collection of Emperor Justinian's legal theories re-emerged at the University of Bologna in Italy. This triggered a revival of his attitudes and punishments on homosexuality, which influenced European feelings and practices. It was then that the clergy itself became the focus of constant criticism. In the middle of the century, Peter Damian wrote the text The Book of Gomorrah for Pope Leo IX. Damian was a cardinal and doctor of the church. He was also an important figure who helped to shape Gregorian reform, a movement led by Pope Gregory VII, which was concerned with the moral integrity and independence of the clergy. In the text, Damian listed 4 categories that qualified as sodomy: solitary masturbation, mutual masturbation, sex between the thighs of 2 partners of the same sex, and anal sex, which he maintained was the most abhorrent. Strangely, oral sex is not included in the list, but Damian considered sodomy even more evil than bestiality. Damian believed that the wicked behaviour of the clergy was beginning to incite violence from the lay people who were outraged. He said homosexuals should not be ordained, and those who already had should be dismissed regardless of their circumstances or age. Although Pope Leo supported celibacy for the clergy and agreed that all vice was to be condemned, he rejected the idea of excluding clerics unless they had repeatedly committed offences over a long period. In 1102, the Council of London was convened by Anselm of Canterbury. It started the Gregorian Reformation and banned all of those in holy orders from marriage, drunkenness, and fornication. The council also condemned sodomy, ruling that any cleric found guilty of the crime was to be degraded. It was probably this attempt to establish celibacy throughout the clerical world that helped to develop and nurture revulsion towards those committing homosexual acts. And consequently, the emotional conflicts caused by forced celibacy resulted in an illogical anger towards homosexuality among the people. Of course, money was always part of the equation. The church was becoming wealthier, and if a priest was married, his loyalty would be split between the church and his family. On his death, a cleric was more likely to leave any monies and property that he owned to his surviving wife and offspring, rather than bequeathing it to the church. Meanwhile, over in the Holy Land, the Council of Nablus, led by King Baldwin II and Warrant, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, established a canon law that created punishments for sodomy. They were the first to appear in medieval law. Canon 8 stated that adult sodomites, both active and passive parties, should be burnt at the stake. If the passive party was either elderly or a child, then Canon 9 states that only the active party should be burned and the passive party should repent. According to Canon 11, if a sodomite repents, he can avoid punishment, but if he is found to have committed sodomy a second time, he will be allowed to repent again, but he will then be exiled. The Christian mystic and polymath, Hildegard of Bingen, who was born 7 years after the death of St. Peter Damian, claimed to see visions and chronicled them in an illustrated work known as Scivias. In the second book, she described how God condemned same-sex intercourse between women, saying, quote, "A woman who takes up devilish ways and plays a male role in coupling with another woman is most vile in my sight, and so is she who subjects herself to such a one in this evil deed." Later in the 13th century, the Dominican friar and theologian Thomas Aquinas was a proponent of natural law, believing it is through the act of sex that new life is created, and this is impossible in a same-sex relationship. He considered homosexuality an unnatural vice and a sin, one second only to bestiality. And the teachings of Aquinas were extremely influential on the Catholic Church. For them, the main concern was risk of social deviance, which in this case was homosexuality, namely being men who had sex with other men, and so they were condemned as having depraved habits and became persecuted. Knights. The circumstances in which knights were trained would have encouraged an intimacy between the noble youths. They were taught to live together as a brotherhood and tutored by an older male. Every moment was spent in one another's company from the age of about 11. Sometimes the unit would stay together until the knights were into their 30s, longer still if suitable marriage partners could not be found. There were several orders of monastic knights, such as the Hospitallers or the Templars, who swore an oath of chastity. The Templars were powerful, extremely wealthy, and during the Crusades were known for being one of the most skilled fighting units who answered only to the Pope. But their downfall came at the hands of King Philip of France. In 1307, Pope Clement V asked the king for help with an investigation into the conduct of the Templars, as an allegation had been raised against the order from a former, ousted member. The king seized upon this accusation. He was deeply in debt from his war against England, having already stripped the Jews of all their wealth and banishing them from France. He now turned his attention to the Templars. On Friday, October the 13th, he ordered the arrest of the Templars, including their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, in Paris. Keen to turn the medieval people against them, the order was accused of what were thought at the time to be the most heinous of crimes, such as denying Christ, spitting on the cross, taking part in indecent kissing and homosexuality, as well as fraud, corruption, and the worship of false idols. And it seems that once again, as with the clergy, any group with all male affiliates was looked upon with some suspicion. It's not surprising that when the Templars were put on trial, it was those that were tortured, mostly in France and Italy, that confessed their guilt. In other European countries such as Ireland, England, and Cyprus, admissions were less forthcoming. And although the Templar accusations of uncontrolled homoeroticism in the 14th century were probably false, the connection between other bands of knights and homosexuality makes it conceivable that same-sex relationships were common and accepted among knights and the nobility in England and Europe during the early and high Middle Ages. Persecution. The Cathar religion came into prominence in the 11th century. By the 13th, it was the dominant faith in the Languedoc region of southern France. The Cathars were vegetarians, believed in gender equality, led austere lives, and had no problem with euthanasia, contraception, or homosexuality. Of course, these teachings were considered sacrilegious by the Catholic Church. This led their persecutors to accuse them of committing sodomy. In 1208, Pope Innocent III ordered a crusade against them. During decades of persecution, thousands of Cathars from all over Europe were massacred by either sword or mass burnings, regardless of either rank, age, or sex. In 1230, the French theologian and canon Jacques de Verty described the city of Paris as being filled with sodomites. He said that, quote, "Prostitutes dragged passing clerics to brothels by force through the streets. Any man who kept a concubine was held in high esteem." A homosexual scandal at the University of Paris in 1292 resulted in the expulsion of many tutors and students alike. Male prostitution, lesbianism, and trans people were seen in Venice and Rome, and in Parma, the friar and historian Salambian de Adamo said homosexuality was especially common amongst scholars, clerks, and nuns during the 13th century. In the 13th century, Alfonso X of Castile and Leon in Spain ordered the first ruling in Europe that called for castration and stoning as the punishment for any, quote, sins against nature, which included sodomy. It could be said that the brutality of these punishments for homosexuals was not out of proportion with those dealt out for what were seen as other offences before God at the time. It was common for limbs to be removed for transgressions such as adultery and blasphemy. France made sexual acts between people of the same sex a crime in 1206. Punishment was removal of the clitoris or testicles for a first offence, and amputation of the breasts or penis for a second transgression. A third warranted a burning at the stake. 10 years later, Louis IX made anal sex a capital crime, also punishable by burning. And in 1292, in what is now modern-day Belgium, the very first execution in Western Europe was carried out on 2 men for a same-sex act. And in 1432, Florence became the first European city to establish a special court to prosecute offences of sodomy. Over the next 70 years, the officers of the Knights charged more than 10,000 men and boys, convicting at least 2,000 who avoided additional punishments by paying a fine. We can only be thankful that today, huge political movements have reversed most of these oppressive laws around a lot of the world. But it's important to look back and study these evil doings of the time.